Okay, we started definitely here myself now. So first of all, I just want to welcome all of you to this seminar today on UN peacekeeping in Africa. It is delightful to see so many people here. It's a topic that, of course, has gone off the radar a little bit in a European context because of what's happening just around us in the Middle East, in Eastern Europe, Ukraine. But for that reason, I'm also extremely delighted that, that the Danish Foreign Policy Society contacted me and said we have some cash to do a seminar on peacekeeping in Africa. Is it something that we could collaborate on? And of course, I jumped at it because this is something that I've been working on for the last 10 years, and it's something very close to my heart in many ways. And also, it would give me the opportunity to sort of coordinate with my colleagues at the Foreign Policy Society to have some really interesting speakers come to Denmark and talk to you about peacekeeping in Africa. So I would like to just so also a little change in the program. Charlotte Flint was not able to make it, and Katja Jakobsen wasn't either. So we have now rolled the welcome, the moderation, and a small presentation into one person, which is me. I'll try to sort of separate the different roles. I'll shorten my presentation a little bit and then focus on the moderation and the welcome, as I'm doing right now. So the presentations and the presenters that are here. We have 5 presentations and a Q&A session in the end, and we have Charlotte Slinde, who is the head of the Danish Refugee Council, director of the Danish Refugee Council, also has a long career behind her in the Danish diplomacy, so has a lot of experience talking about the Congo, which she will do in her presentation. After that, we will have Arthur Butelli talk about Mali. Mali, obviously, where the UN was kicked out of recently in 23, but also one of the biggest, most militarized missions that the UN has deployed. Arthur is working for the Institute for International Peace Institute, and he's also written just recently a book on MINUSMA, the mission in Mali, and has worked for the mission also. So we have a lot of experience there. And then Fifi Edu-Aful, who is working for UNIDIR, which is the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, will speak about Sudan, South Sudan. And I have also worked with Fifi for a long project when he worked for the Kofi Annan International Peacekeeping Training Center in Ghana, Accra. So also a lot of experience looking at, analyzing, working with missions, understanding missions. We will then switch gear a little bit. We'll have a break and then switch gear a little bit where Christian Ning, who is a professor at the Kofi Annan International Peacekeeping Training Center, also has a long, extensive career in both NGOs, international organizations, AU, the UN, working around security, working around counterterrorism, peacekeeping, and is one of sort of, I would say, the key experts on West African dynamics, who will speak on the impact of geopolitical shifts on peacekeeping missions. And then we have David Johannes, who is working for Institute for Security Studies in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Also one significant expert on how the AU works, how the AU deploys missions, organizes them, designs them, and understanding of the Horn of Africa, where of course a lot of attention has been, especially with the AU mission in Somalia. But in general, also understanding the dynamics between Ethiopia, Somalia, Kenya, and how that plays out. We will then have sort of the discussion in the end, where all the panel participants will come up here, I assume, and we will have a conversation, a Q&A with everybody in the room. So I would say this is a pretty amazing program that I'm looking forward to, and I think also that will throw up a lot of important questions about where we are with peacekeeping operations. What does it mean in today's geopolitical sort of situation where the focus is really in Europe, where a lot of the money for these missions has come, where it's elsewhere than the African continent. I just spoke to Arthur just before we started here, and Africa is still the neighbor of Europe. Whether we want to recognize sort of the importance of Africa, it is an important neighbor, it's an important partner. And it's not less important just because there are other issues to look at. So therefore, this seminar, I think, is very timely just to make people think about the world that we're living in beyond Ukraine and Israel, Gaza. So that was a welcome. I will then now turn a little bit, just do a very brief presentation on the historical history of UN peacekeeping, because I think it's important to sort of recognize that peacekeeping has always been sort of a response to the geopolitical situation of the world. When peacekeeping was first when the UN Charter was first defined in San Francisco in 1945, there was no sort of word for peacekeeping. Peacekeeping was not a concept. There was a line between Chapter 6, which was to resolve conflicts in the world, and then also Chapter 7, which is about the UN mandating sort of like enforcement of a certain situation. But the concept of peacekeeping was not really did not exist. So three issues, three sort of like moments in history over the next 15 years really define what peacekeeping was going to become. And I think it's also important to say that whatever an organization experiences their first sort of like situation where they need to deal with that situation is really also going to define the organization. And this is also the case for the UN. We have very important in 1948, where the Arab-Israeli war, to sort of there was a mission that was set up to monitor the situation between Arabs and Israelis in '48, and that really set the precedence for the fact that there's no immediate political settlement, but there's observation, rather than sort of like trying to resolve conflicts, resolve sort of political situation. There was 1956, the Suez Canal crisis, where the Suez Canal was nationalized by the Egyptian president at the time, Nasser, which ignited a response from Europeans and from Israel. And 5 minutes? How is that possible? But very quickly, it ignited a response from the UN. The UN set up its first sort of military mission to deal with that issue, and it really was a success because of the sort of the acceptance of the parties to the conflict to have the UN play this role. So it was actually seen as a success. Pearson, the Prime Minister of Canada, was given the Nobel Peace Prize for this initiative. So it was really something that defined the UN. And then there was a crisis in Congo, a very messy decolonization process where the UN was involved and also pushed almost into, in effect, war fighting, and also sort of experienced a lot of failures in that, I would say, in that mission. And it really also stopped UN from playing sort of a significant role around the world in peacekeeping. There were 13 missions between 1960 and the end of the Cold War, and they were really not sort of, they were cautious missions. This all changed dramatically with the end of the Cold War. Very quickly, you can see here the amount of operations, how it rose after when the Cold War ended. Obviously, there was a massive sort of expansion of the mandates that the missions had. There was also, of course, a reflection of the fact that the West had won the Cold War, and therefore peacekeeping really became an instrument of sort of promoting liberal democracies, human rights around the world. The missions went from cautious observation operations to state building, which happened in Kosovo, in East Timor. It had expanded dramatically on the mandates, so it was both about demobilization, institution building, elections, what have you. So it became a much more sort of like, it became an instrument of promoting a certain political entity, which was in effect the Western state during the 1990s, which changed with 2001, where obviously interventions in general became more militarized, but it also meant that the UN deployed in became more dangerous and became more about actually deploying in ongoing conflict, which had not been the case previously, at least not in terms of mandate. And we have big missions that turned into these types of operations like the Congo. We have Mali, which also is an example, and the Central African Republic. And I would say one of the problems with these types of missions is also that the UN overstretched. So it overstretched politically because it was inserted in a context where it did really not have the political strength to sort of settle conflict. And even, as we know, with what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, when it's one country that is leading that process, it's still extremely difficult and possibly unsuccessful, the process. But imagine if there are a lot of different countries with a lot of different levels of expertise and training that are inserted and have to coordinate these types of missions. So it really became sort of an overstretch politically. It became an overstretch in terms of its ability to implement mandates. And there was a caution after, I would say, 13, 14, when the Central African Republic and Mali happened, where really no big missions were being deployed for extensive period of time, and actually until this day. What happened in between 14 and now, of course, is Trump, and sort of like questioning what multilateralism actually is, questioning what the UN is supposed to do, questioning what the UN is even able to do, and it's distorted the conversation about the UN, I think, to a large extent, because the UN is an important body, and we will never get something like that if we had to sit down and agree on a way of collaborating across the world. So there are a lot of issues, but there are still a lot of issues with the UN that needs to be discussed. For instance, what types of missions should the UN be deploying? What is it capable of? What can we learn from these sort of huge missions that deployed in open conflict in terms of what we can expect from the UN? And I think that it's really an important conversation to be had. Maybe in this political environment, it's quite a difficult task, but I have 0 minutes left. But it's nevertheless, at this stage, very, very important that we have this conversation about what peacekeeping should be. Okay, so my time is up. I would like to invite Charlotte to come to the podium and talk about, let's say, Congo dynamics. Right. Relating to, yeah?
Yes, sounds just good.
Good. And what do you want?
For changing slides, what... Can I pause this one?
Yes. I'll sit next to you.
Good afternoon, all. And thanks for the opportunity to participate in this panel today. First of all, I'd like to put all the caveats. I am in no way an expert on UN peacekeeping operations, but I see around in the crowd here some good old colleagues who are. So I've been invited here to focus specifically on the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, not to confuse with DRC, the Danish Refugee Council that I represent. And the Danish Refugee Council has been working in DRC for over 16 years now, including in the provinces that are most affected by conflict, also now North Kivu and Ituri provinces, not in South Kivu, which is also affected. And maybe you do want to see a map of this vast, vast country that DR Congo is. And And as a humanitarian organization that specializes in forced displacement, we are also delivering aid in a number of the neighboring countries, Burundi, Tanzania, Uganda, as well as 25 other countries around the globe. So let me start by clarifying that DRC, the Danish Refugee Council, does not engage directly with MONUSCO, the UN operation mission in DR Congo, or the specific peacekeeping activities in Congo. We focus on responding to the consequences for civilians when peacekeeping and when protection for civilians fails in wars and conflict. And this is actually what we do witness at the present moment in DR Congo. So this part of Congo is actually a hotbed of crisis, has been so for decades by now. It's fueled by this conflict by a very weak state, by corruption, but also lack of territorial control. And the situation is also in recent years has become aggravated by other actors' involvement, the regional actors' involvement, including neighboring countries like Rwanda, Uganda, and Burundi. And this has actually created quite an intractable regional security crisis that hinders the attempts of peaceful resolutions and also, to some degree, undermines MONUSCO's efforts to protect civilians on the ground. The UN Security Council has, on numerous occasions, obviously renewed the mandate of MONUSCO and has done so recently until the end of this year, 2026. And that renewal happens amidst ongoing clashes on the ground in the eastern part of the country. And since we saw a very violent escalation of the conflict a year ago, we have witnessed a documented number of deaths on the increase, 7,000 deaths, potentially much more in these eastern provinces of Congo. And we also see that the region suffers systematic and large-scale sexual violence, forced recruitment of children into war, and obstacles to the much-needed humanitarian aid, for that aid to reach the population and for the population actually to get access to the assistance. What we see, I would say, in general on UN peacekeeping operations and missions at this moment in time in the history is that they are up against a lot of geopolitical tension. And they are also up against fragile support. And that is sometimes both political fragile support and derived therefrom also relatively fragile economic support, which means that a number of the operations are underfunded and therefore understaffed and have difficulties in actually living up to the mandate. And sometimes for these missions, the increasingly long lists of tasks that missions have to take upon themselves on the ground. And this is no different from MONUSCO, where this situation is also a reality, and it is entangled there in that very complex Great Lakes context that I'm not going to go too deep into. The operational constraints on the ground and these political complexities that we see, they have hampered MONUSCO's mandate to protect civilians and create stability in the region. So we are seeing that there is now violence between the national army and various armed groups, and these tensions and these conflicts continue, and the regional tensions have worsened despite various and multiple diplomatic efforts of different groupings of countries and different constellations. So as a consequence, we now see what we would call a protection vacuum that is emerging as the national and local alternatives to peacekeeping and stabilization are not in place in DR Congo. I'd like to share with you some of the perspectives from the ground on the humanitarian situation and outlook, as well as how DRC's humanitarian work contributes directly and sometimes indirectly to peace and stability in the country. I'll also share at the end of my presentation some reflections on MONUSCO's mandate and work, again based on our own operational experience and that perspective. The number of people in dire need in DR Congo is extremely high. We say, and the analysis that we manage and the data that we manage is close to 15 million of people in need for protection and humanitarian assistance during this year. 15 million, almost 3 times as many people than live here in our country. So we have also been through a very sudden and drastic cuts in humanitarian aid to DR Congo, announced in 2025. That has been part of broader cuts, and here it's not only the US that is cutting funds, but also a number of other donors. And that has curtailed, obviously, the ability of organizations to respond to an ever-increasing and worsening humanitarian situation in the eastern part of the country, as well as more broadly across DR Congo. We must not forget that the situation in the northern province of Ituri also remains very critical, with very limited presence of humanitarian organizations as we speak. Today, we see in DR Congo that there are around 5.7 million internally displaced people in these eastern provinces, many with host families which often do not have the resources to support them. They live in informal settlements or very damaged camps or very rudimentary camps. So last year alone, more than 2.1 million people have been forced to flee the region altogether. And this displacement often becomes long-term, protracted, and repeated, and multi-directional, moving in all kinds of direction, with many people having to flee many times over the years due to cyclical patterns of violence unfolding during this crisis. What we also see is that internally displaced girls and boys are traumatized. They do not go to school. They are resorting to begging as a means of living, or looking for very odd jobs in exchange for food. And we have heard of girls that are engaging in survival sex on the ground. There are also reports of boys and men that are being forced to join the armed groups. And displaced people, they fear retaliation if they should be forced to return from where they came from. And they face extortion and physical assault and abduction along the way. So the presence of armed group members in and around Goma, as well as throughout North Kivu, is further terrorizing those displaced people. Not a nice place to be a civilian. 1 year ago, I was actually given the chance to brief the UN Security Council on the humanitarian situation in DR Congo. Why were we asked? Because no national organization dared to show up and give that evidence, because it is a very critical situation on the ground. Since then, we have seen increasing difficulties and operational constraints that impact our ability, not only us as an organization, but many other humanitarian organizations, to provide that life-saving assistance that is needed for the civilians that are in dire need. What we see now, as I said, is a worsening situation in the operating environment on the ground. We are doing what we can to identify alternatives and practical ways to reduce the severity of the impacts of this crisis for the civilians. For instance, we try to position our support and our supplies in advance along alternative routes and scaling up also area-based and cash, multi-purpose cash assistance where the local markets allow us to do so, where there are markets, where there are goods to be bought. But the situation is such that without improvements in our ability to both safely and rapidly and unimpededly get access to the population in need, the displacement and acute needs that we see in the East are likely to stay very high in the coming months, with a surge in periodic times driven by the conflict dynamics and movement restrictions on the ground. Humanitarian aid and action is obviously first and foremost a support to alleviating the suffering on the ground and protect and save lives. However, evidence also clearly shows that life-saving assistance also contribute to stability and to peace on the ground. So access to food, access to health, to shelter, to water, that obviously helps prevent competition for scarce resources and prevent that from escalating into violence. What we also see is that activities of protection of the most marginalized and fragile groups of people and population reduce the exposure that people have to violence, to exploitation and abuse, and that obviously lowers the grievances levels in these communities that are affected by the crisis. So just to say that humanitarian assistance also has a peace and stability building effect. Let me just illustrate this point by some few examples from our work in Congo. First, in Eastern Congo and elsewhere, our operations are based on sound, contextually designed conflict analysis. This is to make sure that everything that we do is conflict sensitive and ideally also contribute to social cohesion and resilience, while at the same time upholding our humanitarian access to the people that need so. So it can contribute to entry points for longer-term peace-building work on the ground. Secondly, in DR Congo, but also in many other places where we work, we use forecasting and risk-informed data and analysis, community-based indicators and local knowledge to anticipate where conflict will and can escalate, where there are climate shocks and compounded risks, and where we can then trigger early action to these situations before the predictable shocks install themselves in these crisis situations, such as conflict, displacement, climate, and how we can translate that into humanitarian support to avoid very severe humanitarian emergencies on the ground. And thirdly, we collect also and use data to monitor the abuses taking place on the ground. We try to establish channels for evidence-based reporting mechanisms and oversight. In last year, 2025, our protection monitoring activities documented more than 1,000 violations in Ituri. That is one of the areas that experience large-scale displacement fueled by conflict. And what do we do with that data? We use it for targeted advocacy actions to pressurize authorities to address these violations that are happening, try to improve the service delivery and strengthen accountability. Obviously, this does not create peace, but it reduces the pressure that drives violence and instability at community level. Then finally, I'm going to give you some reflections on MONUSCO's mandate and recommendations for peacekeeping in Congo looking ahead. Also for ensuring safe and unimpeded humanitarian access for humanitarian organizations such as DRC. But just to say, internally MONUSCO faces a situation of lack of troop commitment, limited resources, as I said up front. It's also sometimes criticized by communities of being ineffective against the many armed groups, also the regional armed groups that are involved. And it's often blamed for failures by the Congolese government itself and army. And these actors are actually who bear the primary responsibility for protection of civilians and security on the ground. MONUSCO's mandate itself is also sometimes criticized for not adapting sufficiently to the very extremely complex context of DR Congo. And we see that in the mandate there is an increasing amount of tasks that MONUSCO is being asked to fulfill. And that obviously puts a lot of pressure on the resources of MONUSCO and results in a crisis of confidence. So this means, and I'm telling that to demonstrate how mandates of these kind of missions need to be adjusted continuously. And in the case of MONUSCO, we need to see that that mandate is inserted also into a regional strategy because many regional actors are engaged here. In terms of the protection of civilians and a situation where there is a transition from MONUSCO into other ways of engaging with peace building in Congo, because we cannot expect MONUSCO to stay on for forever. And basically it was planned some time ago that the mandate should expire and no longer be prolonged, but then the crisis re-emerged or intensified and the mandate was prolonged. But first and foremost, the UN Security Council must commit to what you can call a conditions-based, but also a consultative transition plan for MONUSCO on the ground. From our experience on the ground in Congo and elsewhere, the pace and the sequencing and the coordination of a drawdown of any peacekeeping operation is absolutely critical for what comes after a peacekeeping operation. This plan must ensure that the humanitarian protection and access are paramount in the philosophy and vision there. It must also include concrete action, access and protection measures, including early warning systems in communities, deconflicting arrangements, and continuity of essential services so that civilians do not experience a protection vacuum on the ground. We also see that we need investments in community-based protection. That is a must. However, it's not feasible that we request that the responsibility for protection is shifted onto communities themselves, but rather complement sustained advocacy and state accountability and civilian protection obligations in allowing communities to safely enhance resilience and preparedness among ongoing conflicts on the ground and external protection present. MONUSCO currently plays a key role in protection of civilians. For example, when civilians flee militias, they seek refuge at MONUSCO's operating base. And any further reduction in troop numbers must not diminish the capacity in these key hotspots where civilians typically seek MONUSCO protection in the event of attacks. And this is a very common role, not only in DR Congo, but in many peacekeeping operations, that is the way the base of these operations work. MONUSCO has invested very heavily during years in local protection committees and community alert networks for early warning, for reporting, for rapid response. It's important that that support to these local communities and networks is maintained also after a peacekeeping operation. Secondly, and I got the sign that I'm about to run out of time, the international community must support local peace-building efforts to rebuild the trust and social cohesion amongst local communities that have been torn apart by years of war. So when conditions on the ground improve and allow for the displaced people to voluntarily, hopefully, and safely begin to return to the areas that they came from, to their villages, they might find that their farms, their houses are totally destroyed or occupied by others, and they'll be left scrambling for food and a means to survive. So it will be very, very critical to rebuild their lives. And I think that is also one of the lessons. You should not withdraw international support when a peace-building mission is being rounded off, because that is when very severe elements of fragility in returning to normalcy is extremely dire, so international engagement must stay on. And as you can imagine, this is a very critical thing to say, because this is not the picture that we are seeing around the world. Basically, the international community is leaving behind crisis situation much before crises have been settled, and oftentimes long before peace-building missions of the UN have been withdrawn. The international community's financial support and peace-building support to these countries is actually being eroded. So just to say that humanitarian assistance moving forward is very important. It needs to remain needs-based and ring-fenced also from stabilization efforts. Those are two different things. We need to cater for the protection of civilians, for the support to civilians, and look at that as a separate thing. I think time is running out, so I'd better stop here. Thank you very much.
So I think this is a really interesting case, Congo. Obviously, there was an attempt to militarize MONUSCO quite dramatically in order actually to, of course, face militias. And the results have been questionable. Yeah. So it is also about what can we actually expect of the UN in the future in terms of going into the mission. Should we just expand them into these really, really complex wars in huge territories, or do we need to find other roles for them that cannot go into defending, for instance, or safeguarding, protecting civilians across a territory like Congo? So I think that's some very difficult questions to be answered. But I would also like to ask out in the audience. Yes, there is a question I can see. So just a very quick question that is burning, that you can wait until the Q&A. Please, Mike.
Excellent introduction. There are some.
You know each other clearly.
There's much history that we could delve into in this case, which we'll have to leave aside. But there are two recent events which need to be mentioned, and one of them may potentially be contributing to the solution. The White House says that a peace deal has been signed.
Yes. Between
Rwanda and DRC. You didn't mention anything about the content of that peace deal and what implications it might have for UN peacekeeping. Probably none at all, but I'd be interested to hear if you have any comments on that. And secondly, for whatever reasons, rather obscure reasons in my opinion, Denmark has decided to invest heavily in supporting one of the parties in the conflict. The Rwandan government has just recently benefited from the opening of a Danish embassy. Could the Danish embassy focus significantly on peacekeeping efforts or peace-building efforts? Is that an option? Are you discussing it in DRC with the Danish diplomats involved? Because, you know, if there's one thing that would make a bit of sense in opening an embassy like that, it would be to massively beef up support for peacekeeping operation in the region. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Mike, for very good questions that I'm not able to answer.
Well,
I mean, I would say, Trump has a record of settling peace in, I think, 8 to 9 countries. His State of the Union said, I think, 9. I don't remember whether he mentioned this one. He for sure did. You can assess as well as I can what is it that comes out of that. I think to say something in general about these peace efforts that I'm obviously not close to, and we are not part of that environment at all as an organization, but where the Trump administration is involved, it's left piecemeal, and it's more a signal, but there is no sort of continuity of effort. It seems as if they are running out of steam and interest and energy when an announcement has been made, and one can say that could also be a risk here. So I would not be too optimistic about that peace agreement to really pave the way for peace. But what we do need to see is that there are so many actors that are involved to one degree and another. So it would be very nice if also some of the regional organizations, African Union and others, could make an effort to ensure that all different kind of actors could engage in a coherent way, engage in coherent discussions on peace that could point in one direction and not be as diverse as the pattern that we are seeing now. As to whether the new Danish embassy in Rwanda could engage here, of course they could. The ministry could decide to engage. What we are discussing with the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs is obviously support for humanitarian assistance, because that is our bread and butter. That is what we are good at doing. And the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs does contribute humanitarian assistance into DR Congo as well. But obviously, when you have an embassy, a diplomatic representation on the ground, you have a possibility of actually playing a role here. Whether the Danish government is going to do that, I'm not sure.
Thank you. Please, Arthur, please come to the floor. Arthur has, as I said, has just written recently, published a book on MINUSMA, and has worked for the mission, has worked in the region for a long time, has worked in international policy making for a long time. So he is in a very good position to talk about Mali and the mission in Mali that was terminated in 2023 for political reasons. So, Arthur, you.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks to the IIS, the Ministry, and the Danish Foreign Policy Society for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be back. It's also a pleasure to come after Charlotte. I started my international career many years ago in humanitarian NGOs and emergency conflict situations in the Middle East. And I remember at the time I had concluded that DRC was the best of the organizations that I wanted to work for. Then unfortunately it was picked up by the UN to do different type of work, but I still very much value, and after that seen the work of DRC in various contexts. So I'll be talking about Mali. So what you see here, so we're changing context from the DRC. You see the landscape is a little bit different. That's northern Mali, the town of Kidal, which is historically the where most of the rebellions started, and these are the peacekeepers when they're actually departing in 2023 after the Malian authorities, led by a junta, stunned the Security Council, really. I mean, the relationship between the UN and the host nation had deteriorated, but it was still, very much a surprise when the Malians asked for the withdrawal without delay of the mission, which then took place in a record time, really, in the history of peacekeeping in less than 6 months, and actually pretty challenging circumstances that I'm happy to discuss in the Q&A if you wish. But why do I start with this? because, in many ways, this departure, I'll argue, was the result of the mission, being caught in geopolitical crossfire, which is, the subtitle of my book. So I try to walk you through the different sequences of the mission. And the presentation today is based on my book, which itself is based on my, it's like an updated version, let's say, of my PhD thesis, which included a long Mali case study. I, of course, served in MINUSMA the first 2 years of the mission, so I arrived at the very beginning. That's a younger version of myself in 2013, meeting with armed groups. So I was in charge of DDR, so engagement with armed groups, and I was part of the team that supported the peace negotiations. And then after my 2 years there, after the signing of the agreement, I left the UN, and I visited on average like once or twice a year for my research. And I, of course, followed a lot of the debates in New York. So it's a longitudinal case study for the students among you. And basically, it's a comparative analysis of sequences of time, periods over time. My ambition, as someone who had worked in peacekeeping and then on peacekeeping in various think tanks and in academia, was to take a step back. I don't know if some of you are familiar with Roland Paris, the Canadian scholar. He talks about micro versus macro, and a lot of what I've been doing in practice, but also in think tanks, was studying the micro level, right? Trying to fix the peacekeeping here and there on the ground, or through policies. And there, like the idea, the ambition was to take sort of a step up. And to look at the peacekeeping as an object, right? As the mission as an object, and to factor in a lot more of the geopolitics into this, and to try to reconcile in some way empirical studies with a bit of IR theory. So what are some of my the headlines before I dive into the different time periods? Well, basically, as I said, in an era of geopolitical change, as the conference today is about, MINUSMA has in many ways been, one of the richest laboratory of contemporary peace operations. It was one of the largest stabilization mission, but I don't know how familiar all of you. I put a few photos so you can try to project yourself if you've never been in those contexts. But a stabilization mission, a large stabilization mission, you're talking 12,000 troops. Still very few troops, considering the size of the country. A couple of days ago, I flew over to Copenhagen from the south of France. It took me 2 hours. I remember my flights from Bamako to northern Mali, where I was, were longer than that, okay? Just to give you a sense of the size of the country. A budget of 1 billion, 1.2 billion a year. So again, the largest with MONUSCO, the mission in the Congo, but again, still fairly inexpensive and small compared to maybe NATO operations, if some of you are familiar with that. What was particular on MINUSMA also was there was a significant European component to it. Still less than 10%, and Peter has written about this, and DIS has done a lot of great work about this. Still limited, but significant, because the Europeans had been largely absent from peacekeeping in Africa, since the mid-90s, let's say. They were still in UNIFIL in the Middle East, but absent. Also, there was an important Chinese contingent, including infantry troops, in the mission, which is interesting, even though the majority of peacekeepers were Africans. And then, of course, the mission was operating in parallel to a French force, a French counterterrorism force, authorized by the Council as well, with a UN mandate, but had its own mandate and was not part of the peacekeeping, which also created a number of challenges. And then I argue, that ultimately, MINUSMA became the collateral damage of the new geopolitical rivalries, heightened by the growing influence of Russia on the African continent, and of course, that in the context of the invasion of Ukraine at the very end. I started my PhD thesis before the Russians came into Mali, and that only, not that I thank them for going into Mali, but at least for the purpose of my work and my research, it was actually quite interesting. It added an element of geopolitics there. So now if I go into the different phases, the first The first phase, so I break it down into temporal. So 10-year timeline, right? That's the mission lasted for 10 years. Which is comparable to other large peacekeeping missions in Africa or in the recent periods. Most of them lasted on average 13 years, so it's a little bit shorter because it was kicked out. But still, it's an important length. And the first period, like between the rollout of the mission and the peace agreement, was characterized by basically a council that was, at the time united. All the decisions were unanimous about the mandate. Even though the French were the pen holder and very much driving the strategy, they managed to convince others. The main frictions during the first phase were with the region, right, with the African Union. I mean, I won't go into the details, but there was an African-French mission initially that rolled out, and the Africans were hoping to at least get the leadership of the mission. If they couldn't maintain their mission, they didn't get that. It created some frustration. It was still a compromise between the powers in the nature of the mandate that was then very complicated to implement, but there was a broad agreement on the direction of the mission. Then France also mobilized the European contributing countries. That's largely the reason why the Europeans rolled out, marking their return. But that also created their own dynamics, including what I think, Peter, you coined that term, right? The two-tier mission between the Europeans and the Africans. After the signing of the agreement, we had a more coherent mandate, but difficult to implement. And that's the signing of the peace agreement with foreign minister. The lead mediator was Algeria, the foreign minister of Algeria, Mr. Lamamra, and the signing ceremony. Now, the second phase, which is 2016 to 2019, is quite different from the first one. And there, in my book, I talk about how the terrorism environment was really what dominated that part of the mission life, with a lot of debate over the relevance of the peacekeeping operation, including in the Council in this context, terrorism affected context. The Council, under pressure from the host country and with support from the French, decided to adjust the mandate to a more proactive and robust approach, which frankly didn't make much of a difference on the ground, but maybe created expectations that were even more difficult to meet for the mission. These issues featured quite prominently in the 2018 Independent Strategic Review, which was quite controversial. We have the author. We have the pleasure of having Ellen, the author, here. So if you have any question about that, you can ask her. But what was interesting, it's not just the review. I think it was a broader, tension during that phase within the P3, which is quite unique, between France and the US very much at the time. That period and that review crystallized a bit some of those tensions between those two countries. So we see cracks in the Security Council within the Western P3, let's say, at the time. That is quite unique. So that's to illustrate the mission. That's one of the camps in the north that had been attacked, a suicide attack, and the second photo is an attack on one of the joint mechanism to bring together post peace agreement the rebel forces and the Malian forces. Now the third phase of the mission brings in a new type of geopolitical dynamic. I call it the return of the East-West divide. So a more traditional, between the permanent 5-member of the Council, between the P3 and the P2, P2 being China and Russia. And so the divide during the previous period between the France and the US is very much replaced by this more classical one. You see a power struggle between France and the Malian junta, because there'd been a coup or two successive coups that brought a military junta in power in Mali that was supported by Russia and the Wagner group of mercenaries, which led to the French departing from Mali, which also created a new set of challenges for MINUSMA that then was the main international force left, let's say, in the front line there. The divide was born on the ground, but of course intensified with the invasion in Ukraine, and that's what I also show in the book, is that there are geopolitical dimensions that play out in the field and some that play out in New York in the Council, and the two are not sheltered from one another. So what happens in the field might affect the dynamics in the council, and conversely, whatever happens in the council then usually has an impact on the ground. The mission, in the context of the departure of the French, tried to reaffirm its impartiality, but had limited leverage over these rivalries and became ultimately the victim of the geopolitics. And although the trigger, we can discuss the trigger of the decision of the Malian authority to request the departure, which included a specific report on human rights violation that had been committed by the Malian forces together with their Russian allies in Moura. But I think it's deeper than that, and the deeper part is very much the geopolitics. So that's just to illustrate. That's the President Goïta, so the military leader of the junta during the Security Council visit. So you see the dynamics in the room are quite particular. And the bottom is the first photo that came out in the press of a Wagner group presence in Mali. So lessons, if I have a few more minutes.
Yes, you have.
Yeah, okay. So I want to cover a few lessons from MINUSMA for UN peace operations in what I call a post-liberal international order. I think these can be, I don't have time to dive into them, so I'll just give you some of the headline, but I think the debate that was very much brought out by the 2018 review, but that is a part of a bigger conversation, is about the relevance of peace operations in contexts affected by terrorism. What I say there is, in many ways, MINUSMA showed it was able to adapt to the threat itself. So, it was able to limit the casualties over time, to adapt, on the ground. But, at the strategic level, there was a lot of questions that were never answered about, what a mission is meant and can actually do. Then, a lot of competing visions of the primacy of politics between, what the council conceives and what is actually worked out at the level of the field, and especially of the leader of the mission. I think Mali and MINUSMA also is a good example of the what we see, and now we saw at the time, but now you see much more obviously, which is a pushback against some of the liberal norms on human rights, protection of civilians, gender, etc. Now it's just across many of the council divisions, but Mali was, I think, one of the first examples. I think Mali also says a lot about, but that's a whole conversation in itself, about the limits of integrated multidimensional approaches. I won't go into the liberal versus liberal status quo versus revisionist powers, but I think that's another interesting thing I discuss in the book. And by the way, if your university wants to buy the book, great. But otherwise, I don't tell to buy the book because it's too expensive, frankly. But if you're interested, happy to share a PDF or ebook with any of you. Okay. So just in a couple of minutes that I have left, what is what I see as my modest contribution to these discussions on peacekeeping in this new geopolitical era, or however you framed it here. I try to do both a sort of an empirical and a theoretical contribution, as I was saying, and trying to contribute to the rapprochement between peace operations and international relations, something others have done, and notably John Calsford and a colleague Oxetmitna have done in some of the books. I think Cedric de Kooning also, and others. So it's very much part of that. The literature over the last 30 years on peacekeeping had been largely dominated by the liberal schools, and there was the local turn, etc. And I think there wasn't that much. Now, of course, in the last couple of years, because of the you can't really avoid the geopolitics. I think there's been some people have been trying to catch up with that. I try to bring a sort of a realist, constructivist lens to analyzing peacekeeping, and specifically MINUSMA, but of course I talk about other missions as well in the book, and I think that challenges this dominant Western liberal paradigm that had dominated over the last 30 years or so since the end of the Cold War. What I offer in the book is also, maybe that's the main contribution maybe to some others who are doing research on this. I offer a typology of how power power and influence is being projected, used by member states especially, but others as well, in what we call the first UN, the second UN, the third UN. The first UN, being the Security Council of the member states, right? The Forum, the General Assembly. Second UN being the UN Secretariat, how this is, the Secretariat itself is not immune to politicization, etc. And the third UN being the think tanks and research institutes like yourself, who also are part of that ecosystem. So I give a framework, and there's a whole table at the end of in those different settings, how different actors use constraint, influence, or resistance as part of those power games, including geopolitical games. Ultimately, I demonstrate how peacekeeping has become a field of confrontation between powers, when in fact, for the longest time, I know you had a number of times here, Richard Gowan in Copenhagen. Richard Gowan speaks about the ability of the Security Council to compartmentalize their differences. And the big trend was that, even though the geopolitics have played in the Council in a number of files, Syria, for instance, even before, if you go back to the war in Iraq, right, 2003, but very much, Syria, Libya, the NATO bombing since the 2010s, there's been a lot of tension over certain files, then Crimea and so on, so the Council was stuck on issues like Syria, Crimea, and Ukraine, but, on peacekeeping file, there was still an ability to have a consensus. So the member states, and especially council members, were divided on certain issues, but it wasn't really affected peacekeeping until, let's say, 2018, approximately. And then you see from 2018 on, and MINUSMA is the case in point, then peacekeeping started being contaminated as well, right? It's no longer immune to those dynamics, those power rivalries. So I try to explain, this phenomenon, how it plays out differently in headquarters, particularly in the council, but in other bodies as well, versus how it plays out in the field mission, including when you have parallel forces. And I controversially probably say that, parallel forces in Mali include, of course, the French counterterrorism force, but also include the Wagner group, right? These are parallel forces, whether you like it or not. How these, and I also explain how those two levels interact with negative consequences on the conduct of the operations, during the operations, right? It constrains the operations, it affects the impartiality, it does a number of things. But also, ultimately, I think on the future of peace operations, which we'll discuss a bit later. To conclude, geopolitics, of course, doesn't explain everything. That's not what I'm trying to say, and I've worked on a lot of other aspects of peacekeeping. But with this work on MINUSMA and this book, I try to show that it's, in this day and age, at least in the last decade or so, it's not possible. But even as you said, the peace operations since their very creation, right, whether you put in 48 or 56 in Suez, has always been a reflection, right, of the state of the world. So even though geopolitics doesn't explain everything, you cannot understand development, historical ones and recent ones, without factoring in geopolitics. Thank you.
To geopolitics, right? Because failures in Iraq and Afghanistan, the US is then regrouping, reorientating itself, but failure of the UN means also lack of resources, lack of faith, and also that we lack a paradigm right now, because we cannot use liberal democracy to sort of guide the UN at this point in time, and therefore we are sort of at a standstill a little bit. What are these missions actually going to be? And MINUSMA is such an interesting case, I think. So thank you very much, Arthur, for this. It was really, really good. I think we'll not do questions until the end with you. And we will go straight to Fifi, because he's waiting in anticipation.
Starting blocks.
And Fifi will be talking about another huge, sort of horribly complex mission in South Sudan, which has a lot of the same dynamics, challenges as MINUSMA had and as MONUSCO has. He is coming now, and he is ready. So, Fifi, the floor is yours. And that one.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Peter, for the kind introduction. And thank you to this, and then the Danish Foreign Policy Society for the invitation to join you this afternoon to discuss one very pertinent peacekeeping operation in South Sudan. It's one operation that is hardly spoken about. That's the UN peacekeeping in Abyei. And so I decided to focus on that peacekeeping operation for today. And our work, my presentation would be as a reflection of field work that we did as part of the Effectiveness of Peace Operations network, basically to assess the effectiveness of that peace operation in Abyei. And so my focus will be in that area. So if I think this afternoon a lot has been said about the setting the scene for the strategic context with respect to the operating environment within which we find ourselves, the fact that the rule-based order is openly being contested, and the fact that right at the heart of the conversation around the Security Council, we have politically fragmented decisions being made, and then also more broadly, the issues around how within the last 10 years, as Peter rightly said in his introduction, there's not been any new large multidimensional peacekeeping mission being created. We are also increasingly seeing, for instance, how host states' consent is more conditional now and more transactional now. And then you also see increasing violence in Africa in most situations. And you've seen how there is also the response and then the shift towards more of regional coalitions and having force-heavy alternatives when it comes to peace operations. So whilst I was thinking about what to present today, I guess there's been a lot of conversation around how peacekeeping is under pressure lately. But I think the real question is how can peacekeeping be more adaptive to the strategically changing environment, and how can we make it more responsive to some of the challenges that we are confronted with? So I decided to focus on the mission in Abyei. I term it as a mission that does not get enough attention, and rightly so, because it's a very small mission. I don't have a map there, but this really is a mission that is set between Sudan and South Sudan. It's a border dispute between the two countries. In 2011, the UN established the UNISFA as a force that was supposed to set between Sudan and South Sudan over the contested Abyei border. Today, that mission faces a lot of challenges that is affecting its effectiveness when you look at it in its broad sense. You are having increased localized violence that is more fragmented. You are having increasingly young people being mobilized to violence in the greater parts of the Abyei region. You see also, for instance, that there's a proliferation of small arms and light weapons within communities in here. And these light weapons, small arms and light weapons, are really within the communities. And so it makes it quite difficult to sort of deal with the challenges of these proliferation. Then you're also seeing increasingly criminal networks that have taken advantage of the dispute to be furthering their own actions from both different ethnic and tribal groups within the region. But you also need to perhaps understand the challenges that confront the two countries when it comes to governance issues. There are huge gaps with respect to governance and then also justice given within the country. And particularly for UNISFA, is one mission that is really suffering from misinformation and perceptions of challenges with respect to the fact that the mission is not really responsive to the needs of the people. I mean, I remember when we went around the field and we were asking them in terms of whether the mission was effective, the communities would tell you they are not effective. So then we asked them, what if the mission was not here? would you be able to deal with the problems? And then they take a seat back and like, nah, the mission has to be here because it provides certain security provisions for them. So these challenges really do exist, and perhaps we need to be able to bear them in terms of the analysis. There's also the challenge of a very small mission having to deal with a very wide sparse area. Throughout the period that we were there, we just couldn't do anything by road. We had to travel by a chopper, and I was wondering how many people can move around different conflict zones with the helicopter. It's quite challenging for that particular mission because when it comes to mobility issues. And so that also perhaps affects the fact that it's not able to generate the early warning signals that goes into their operational planning and how to respond to some of the challenges that they are confronted with over time. So generally, these are the challenges that confront UNISFA, and that for me is a gap between the mandate design and then also the operational realities and how that affects the broader continental patterns that we see in the case of the mission in Abyei. So for me, what is the geopolitical shift? And here I identify like 3 important shifts shaping peacekeeping in Africa that perhaps we need to also bring it to the conversation in Abyei. The first is the Security Council fragmentation, which has already been clearly stated in other presentations that preceded me. And I see consistently increasing mandate renewal that increasingly is political negotiations rather than strategic recalibration. And I think for me, that is where we need to really focus on, because it appears that the periodic yearly mandate renewal has shifted from those kind of conversations to a more political negotiations that we need to perhaps look at again. Then there's also an increasing rise in alternative models. And I think the discussion will come after mine, but we see a lot of ad hoc coalitions, we see a lot of bilateral security partnerships, and we are also increasingly seeing regional-led operations. These models prioritize speed and force projections, often something that is outside the UN framework, and so perhaps that explains why there is a sort of appetite for this rise in alternative models. Then the third one that I wanted to highlight on has to do with the assertive host state sovereignty. You have increasingly governments more willing to challenge UN missions, restrict their movements, and reshape mandate. And I think Atta touched on quite extensively on that, but we've seen it in most of the missions that are dotted all over Africa. We are also having increasing risk to peacekeepers, so it becomes quite challenging for them to be responsive to some of the challenges that are in the mission environment. And particularly for the Abyei case, you see that adaptation lags behind, particularly with issues of the changing environment within which they find themselves. So I was thinking through in terms of lessons that could be learned from the Abyei, the forgotten mission Abyei, to a more pronounced conversation around peacekeeping in Africa. I identify 5 strategic lessons from the Abyei case that perhaps I feel we could look at. The very first lesson has to do with deterrence must be adaptive. So the static posturing does not deter mobile, localized threats. So you should have a mission that is more agile, a mission that is able to respond to the needs of the locals and is able to address the pertinent issues that confront the locals. And here we are looking at how to more like make it more mobile, which we can also perhaps look at the issue, for instance, how to work through intelligence and how to be visibly responsive to the needs of the locality. Particularly in the case of Abyei, when we try to find out the effectiveness of that mission and we ask the mission what actually they think makes it effective, I mean, they drew out a plan that shows the quantity, for instance, of patrols, and then the metric of patrols that they conduct, the short-range and long-range patrols that they conduct in there. But the question is, does it amount to protection in a way? Do the community see this as protection? And for me, that is where the perceived responsiveness come in. Peacekeeping need to move from the symbolic presence to more adaptive posturing where they are able to respond to some of the challenges that they are confronted with. The second one that I wanted to focus on the second lesson from the ABA case has to do with protection must be linked to prevention. And still back to the issue around protection and patrol volumes. We're told consistently about how these patrols help to bring protection. But when you speak to the community about what protection means, it looks like the community's own understanding of protection is different from how the mission actually perceives protection. So the mission is saying we're conducting patrols, but the communities are judging protection about how fast they are able to respond to their needs, or were they present when they were vulnerable, or are they heavily involved in and understanding the conflict dynamics within which they find themselves. And the inability of the mission to be able to understand what the community actually perceives as protection brings that sort of friction where the community thinks that the mission is not doing anything to protect them in that regard. The third lesson that I perhaps glean from the ABA case is civilian capacity is strategic and not supplementary. So the mission itself must respond to those governance gaps as well as those local grievances. And here we are looking at it from the fact that the mission must help with the rule of law, mediation, political engagement. The mission must help to solve those political problems that they are confronted with. And so the civilian capacity is very important. If you look at the ABA mission, the force commander is the head of the mission, so they don't have a civilian head of that mission. That could also have its own challenges. If you understand the politics that have gone on, there was a Nigerian force commander that was removed, and then they brought in a Ghanaian, and it brought in all of these different dynamics in those situations. So you need to also be able to focus on those capacities in them. The fourth lesson has to do with the fact that CIMIC is not a substitute for governance. I think we also need to emphasize that peacekeeping is not a replacement of government. Peacekeeping is just there to do some job. And so if we frame peacekeeping in that sense, then the locals would understand that, listen, your government is supposed to do what it's supposed to do, as in the agreement that you signed with the states, and the peacekeeping is also there to perform a specific function. And so then they would not perhaps fall so heavily on issues of dependency, and where you also have to look at it in terms of the blurring lines between security and development rules. I guess for me, the huge point is that peacekeeping do not come in to replace government, local government, and we need to be able to stress on that point so that the people are able to buy into those kind of conversation. Then the fifth lesson that I will have to touch on has to do with the political strategy must drive deployment. So you're looking at security presence, cannot substitute for political progress. You need to be able, the security approach must complement the political process. So particularly in the case of ABA, without movement in terms of the position of ABA with respect to the final status of ABA, the security gains is going to be challenged. So we really need to be able to get to the bottom of who is supposed to be the rightful owner of ABA. And once we are able to politically decide on that, then the security aspect can complement those particular roles in them. Then the sixth and the final lesson in the case of UNISFA has to do with peacekeeping adapting to weapon proliferation and technological diffusion. And here, for me, this is where actually there is a huge strategic environment shift when it comes to conversations on the continent. You are seeing increasingly proliferation of small arms and light weapons. You are seeing persistent ammunition flow across different borders. You're having a lot of young people arming themselves with rifle and military-grade weapons. And we are also seeing increasingly the use of commercially available drones by non-state armed groups for surveillance and intimidation. So if you look at UNISFE's mandate, it focuses on demilitarization and civilian protection, but the demilitarization framework traditionally prioritizes heavy weapons and state actors. And for me, this is where I think it is important to have the conversation of community-led approaches. How do we build communities into dealing with the arms processes or dealing with the arms challenges that are confronting the mission, and then also ABA in more broadly. So you have community-led arms control being like a protection strategy. You talk about ammunition management becoming a preventive tool, and reintegrating pathways for armed youth to helping to resolve all of these different challenges that we are looking at. So the idea is not to stop dealing with the state, but to find space where you can build communities into managing the weapons that we are being confronted with in there, because we know that the communities have their own lived realities, they have their own lived processes, approaches that have been tested over time that has to do with arms management. So here I'm not really talking about the classical disarmament. I'm talking about how you would use the community to help to manage the weapons that are increasingly being proliferated in some of these areas. So what is the strategic adaptation pathways that we could look at when it comes to looking at ABA, the example of ABA going into the future? The first one is to recalibrate the mandate to current threats, where you build in a reflection of arms proliferation, the use of technology, and how to deal with local violence dynamics. Beyond integrating the arms and ammunition management into the core planning, we need to link mandates to monitoring, diversion, stockpile, security, and also community-level arms control. We need to invest in mobility and intelligence, especially for a mission that is widely sparse with very limited resources. You need to find a way you can use technology to deal with some of the threats and be able to feed into the early warning reporting that they do to help get the right response to some of those challenges. And then also we need to strengthen the regional partnerships, moving from the coordination to joint operational planning with the AU, and then also with the sub-regional actors where they are necessary. And then we need to perhaps align the security with the political strategy. I think that for me is quite important. Deployment must serve the political objectives, not compensate for the absence of it. And most missions in Africa are now struggling with legitimacy issues, right? So we need to be able to, through communication, help to deal with some of those misinformations, disinformation, and how that increasingly is becoming a threat to most missions. We need to be able to deal with that. And then we need to plan for transition early. We need to plan for transition early. If you read Richard Kaplan's book, it talks about how to plan for transition even from the beginning when the missions are being deployed into the environment. But we know the challenges that are in them. No mission is supposed to be there in perpetuity. So the transition must be political, but not purely technical. And we need to be able to manage all of these challenges. In conclusion, there's a need for us to perhaps look at an example of a very small mission or a less spoken about mission like UNISFA, and to see how the conversation around peacekeeping is not obsolete, especially considering the changing times and the contested environment within which we find ourselves. The mission must routinely deal with the mandate renewal in such a way that it addresses those structural issues as well as those risks that they are confronted with on the daily basis. I think moving forward, peacekeeping in Africa should be more politically integrated, and I guess the conversation around the primacy of the politics will not go away with respect to missions. It has to be more agile in terms of the deterrence when it comes to dealing with some of the challenges that they are confronted with. And especially now, where we are having the use of AI and drones. Missions must be more attentive to the arms and ammunition dynamics. And then missions must be more community-based and must be people-centered, as the Secretary General actually says, that missions must be people-centered and must hit on the prevention angle. It's only when we do that that perhaps we would be able to address those realistic challenges that are being confronting missions on the continent. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vicky. Thank you for that really interesting presentation. And I think also, as you said in the end, like maybe this is where UN peacekeeping needs to go, at least for a while, with the smaller, more focused, less politically intense, globally politically intense, I mean, missions. So thank you very much. I think we'll take the questions outside and then take a break. People by first name here. Very interesting sort of beginning to the seminar conference. Some call it conference, some call it seminar. We are now moving into the second part of it, and we have two presentations. We start out with the great Kwesi Anning, professor at the Kofi Annan International Peacekeeping Training Center, also known as KAIPTEC. He will be speaking about the geopolitical dynamics in Africa and how they influence and shape the possibilities of peacekeeping.
Well, thank you very much, Peter, and thank you very much for the invitation. I intend to do about 3 or 4 things. First, to set a bit of a context about the conversation around geopolitics. I mean, Peter says we've always had geopolitics as an aspect of peacekeeping, which is true, but is there a much more transactional, much more evil, much more wicked dimension to the new geopolitics that we are seeing? Then I'll talk a little bit about its impact on the missions themselves. Then I want to bring something in the conversation that I hadn't actually thought of, but as I sat here reflecting and listening to the speakers, we are talking peacekeeping, but what we are really talking about is about peacekeepers. Without peacekeepers, there will be no peacekeeping. So coming from a trading school, what does it mean when these geopolitics come into play? We all know that money is sensitive, that money goes where it is wanted, and money goes where its friends are. So what implications does it have when I tell partner X that I want to trade protection of civilians and I want troops to come from Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso? So I want to talk about some of those dynamics, the real impact of geopolitics on the day-to-day ability of training schools to deliver the peacekeepers to allow peacekeeping to go on. So then I'll do some conclusions, and hopefully we can get a conversation going on. But just about 8 years ago, I did a book with Professor Achaya. And in the book, he described a multiplex world order rather than a multipolar one, where the power of different actors intersect and intermingle rather than stand off against each other. And it suddenly sounds like it's a bedtime story. How we all wish we had this world order. However, the rise of new global powers, the emergence of non-state actors, and the shifting alliances that we see complicate what we've been talking about as geopolitical landscape, characterized by a resurgence of international strategic competition. So fairly tiny, poor, resource-constrained countries like Mali were able to tell the UN, we simply don't want to hear. And it wasn't just a matter of the Russians. France was a bad neighbor, and is still a bad neighbor where I come from. So I work at the Kofi Annan Peacekeeping Training Center, but I've never learned the moderated speech of Mr. Kofi Annan. You know, I always, I always shoot from the hip, so please be ready for that kind of thing. So peacekeeping, as we know it, is under considerable strain because global powers are mounting pressures on each other and between themselves, as Arthur told us. So my former colleague Juan and Paul Williams have just written a report, The Future of Peacekeeping. And they say that peacekeeping is confronted by an increasingly complex and contested environment resulting from the confluence of several factors. Intensifying geopolitical competition, perceptions of partiality, and a trust deficit that I think Fifi spoke about. And of course, the financial pressures also. But let me make this point clear. The monies come from the north. We put our lives and our blood in the line. So when Asa told us that the Europeans came to Mali, they came not to save the Malians, they came because they served their national interest and their geopolitical calculations, including the European Union. So from where we sit, we understand this very differently. In an era marked by this geopolitical fragmentation and rising global tensions, peace operations are facing unprecedented challenges. And it's nothing new, as Peter has told us. But what it means is that it calls for what I'll term new peacekeeping practices. Because the alternative, no peacekeeping, is simply too frightening to consider. So, peacekeeping geopolitics will be with us for a long time. But how do we understand this? There's this notion that Mr. Trump is bringing something different. But probably there's a much more uncertain, unpredictable, dangerous hue to all this. Probably in an emerging era where established principles and norms are being shifted around rapidly. For the mathematicians in this room, derangement theory might probably be something that helps us. This is a theory that provides a lens for understanding and explaining how elements permutate. So what are the elements of the old order? The rule of law, respect for human rights, blah, 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 blah. Derangement theory argues or provides this lens. And the permutation of the elements in such a manner that we should understand how the constituent parts must appear in their original position. Permutation theory allows us, or derangement theory allows us, to understand this form of disorder, in which there are no fixed points. And it's made much clearer by Trini Flockhart, who has argued recently that we are seeing a wave of a more complex order, or I should say, complex disorder of a fragmented and diversifying world, but also of emerging and parallel world orders. A pluralist international system that is beginning to shape itself, arising out of these geopolitical contestations, but different in norms and values. So what is happening now, I would argue, is that the system itself is under attack, as we know it. And I think Arthur or Fifi mentioned, we are seeing an aggressive Chinese support for multilateralism in which they perceive themselves as a leader, using the Belt and Road investments as inducements. We are seeing Mr. Putin that we have all cottoned up to. When he invaded Crimea, we gave him a slap on the wrist. He's a very nice man. He's done something wrong. Let's still bring him into the fold, trying to bring a new Eurasian order. But we're also beginning to see possible orders from the African continent. That says we won't continue to put our blood on the line. We're part of the international system. We've got to find a middle ground. So how do we deal with this emerging African agency? In all these orders that are beginning to emerge, established or in the making, one place where they express themselves very clearly is in the United Nations. And in no other place than the United Nations' most critical flagship program, peacekeeping. But in all these conversations, the peacekeepers are not there. We don't talk about peacekeepers. But history is very important here, the second part. And history must and should serve as a lens through which we understand what is happening. More often than not, we tend to throw history away. And Arthur Marwick has cautioned us that not to know what happened before is to always remain a child, making the same mistakes. Unfortunately, we are all children and making old mistakes. So what are we seeing? Intensified political conflict between the UN's leading member states, and it represents itself clearly in what Arthur has told us. But even in a country like Central African Republic, where the government cannot equip a single police station, suddenly it's become grounds for contestation by the major powers. My argument is that we've been there before, but one of the clearest lessons so far amid these acute political tensions is that peace operations can and must help member states to mount what we earlier on termed as tailored responses to the challenges of international peace and security. But we're also very lazy sometimes. We think it's a one-size-fits-all. And Charlotte, I like your point about peace building being context-specific and sensitive. Look, let me be frank. Capacity building is a business. Because let's ask ourselves, the more money we put into capacity building, into peace building, into XYZ, the less capacity we build. And the people that we are supposed to help, the more they keep on suffering. It raises ethical questions as to whether we are looking at the problems rightly, or we are asking the tough questions that needs to be asked. To remain fit for purpose in this geopolitical world, peacekeeping must continue to adapt and to evolve. In an era marked by this fragmentation and tensions, peace missions will face unprecedented challenges, absolutely no doubt about that. I mean, one of the greatest tensions right now is, what is it? Is it the Fund for Peace or Global something? The Board for Peace. Yeah. The Board of Peace. I mean, I mean, that's most certainly is one of the unfortunate impacts that we are going to see. But let me mention about 4 or 5 before I come to the peacekeepers themselves. First, relates to what I term as the unprecedented challenges to peacekeeping. Wars have become more deadly and more complex. Fifi spoke about the arms. We see young people still fighting. I've just done an arms and ammunition inspection in my country, and it's easy to get these weapons. And settlements have become considerably harder. And missions are being tasked with bigger and more difficult mandates, more complex mandates. And I think Arthur will tell you, at a point in time, the MINUSMA mission had 110 mandates or something, or specific interventions that they had to do. Missions face new threats like violent extremism and terrorism. These are people who haven't heard of the word Geneva. If they've heard of it, they don't really care, and all the rules around war. So how do we train peacekeepers to say, look, go into this extremely violent space in which those who have signed the peace agreements themselves are those who are also leaking weapons and intelligence and satellite imagery to the terrorists. But in an international system where we are unwilling and unprepared to say, Your Excellency X or Your Excellency Y, we've got the data that you are part of this problem, it will continue. And of course, Fifi has told us about the weaponization of new technologies. 2, peacekeeping, because of this fragmentation, is taking place with increasing disregard for international humanitarian law. Shooting peacekeepers and committing atrocities is almost part of the equation now. And amidst all this, geopolitical tensions and internal divisions within the Security Council, we are experiencing the presence and the rising influence, yes, of Mr. Putin and his band of merrymakers. We are experiencing the role of China, but we are experiencing the role of the United Arab Emirates also. Wealthy, willing to fund extremely dubious and dangerous factions, and I think South Sudan is one of them. And we are seeing actors, and also private military and security companies, beginning to have more of a role. So closely related to all these trends are the challenging contexts within which UN peacekeeping operates on the continent. What does the termination of MINUSMA mean for global governance norms? When a small country understands the politics that goes on in the Security Council and uses it as a tool to kick out the UN that, as Fifi has argued, says, look, we are not here to represent how you govern your people. That is your responsibility. You've got to govern your people and govern them well. Provide social welfare goods. And they say, okay, no, look, please get out. Okay? And until we learn how MINUSMA's exit impacts on global governance norms, we are going to see more of this happening. And I'm not surprised that member states are also reluctant to put the money on the table. But that MINUSMA story signals a loss of cachet for the UN, that weak and fragile states can order its departure. Furthermore, Mali also represents a much broader trend in international peacekeeping. Away from the extensive multidimensional missions and the statistics, I think, Peter, you showed it, are very clear. But we are seeing the ad hoc stuff that I think Johannes is going to talk about. More often than not, it's a reflection of the unwillingness of the African Union and the ECOWAS to show leadership. So these ad hoc stabilization missions become a coalition of the willing, not necessarily the most competent, and those who can deliver. A classic case is the Accra Initiative that with much fanfare has collapsed onto itself. How many minutes have I got? 5 minutes. Let's say 5. Peter. Yeah, I think 5 minutes. Good. So, what does this mean? I write to country X that funds my protection of civilians course, which is one of the most popular courses at the Kofi Annan Center, and the election observation course and the election monitoring course. Our courses are normally for about 35 people. And we try to invite the participants from all over the continent, but mainly from the economic community of West African states. But the funder of the course says, I don't like participants from Burkina Faso and Mali. So you have 2 options. Either you take my money and you kick out those countries, or I will withhold my money. Now, if you look at the finest troop contributing countries from the African continent, they are also not all of them are the most democratic. Not all of them are the nicest people in town. So when the funders are talking peacekeeping and waxing lyrical in the Security Council and not taking cognizance of the realities in the operational field, then I think there's a certain level of hypocrisy that we need to call out. Because if we don't train peacekeepers, and I think you know this very well, Your Excellency, if we don't train peacekeepers to a certain level, there'll be no peacekeeping to keep, or there'll be no peace to keep. Because a lot of the soldiers and police officers who come to my center, and Fifi's here, and my other colleague, Ifwa is there, have finished school, and over the past 15, 20, 25 years, have not had any training. So the notions of human rights, the rule of law, respect for women and children, gender-based violence, and all those acronyms, it means very little to them, because for them, not respecting these terminologies is in the line of daily business. So we need to frame a new set of rules about those who make it possible for peacekeepers to get into the operational area. It cannot be business as usual. Because MINUSMA has left, it's become an industry now for people to tell us that the terrorists are coming down south. And I always ask people, coming down south to where? Because from Kidal to the nearest seaport, it's probably about 3,000 kilometers. If we don't put peacekeepers where they are needed, we are going to see the extremists expand. They're going to be much more powerful. Fifi has told us about it. The guns are easy. Diamonds are available. Alluvia go to purchase it. The weaponry are available. So the challenges are massive. I have 2 minutes. So what scenarios can we see? And here I think Adam Day has tried to capture it very nicely. One is that intractability means more of the same. As Fifi said, a lot of these conflicts are becoming just about impossible to deal with. And look, people can brag about resolving conflicts and bringing peace and looking for the peace prize. It doesn't help. The conflicts are intractable. They are becoming much more violent. What it means by extension is that there will be many more conflicts or many more fires burning, but there will be no peacekeepers or competent peacekeepers. There will be no water or peacekeepers to douse the fire. Finally, and I think Charlotte spoke about the regionalization of these conflicts. Because of the way that France and UK and Belgium divided the continent, conflicts cannot and will not be purely internal. They will continue to be regionalized because they will escalate beyond their borders. But peacekeeping is key. 30 seconds. And particularly in a geopolitical state of fragmentation and rising global tensions, UN peacekeeping missions will need renewed political will and strategic adaptation. New York cannot do business as it has always been doing. Missions coming from a training school will remain indispensable tools for protecting civilians worldwide. However, if we don't design new peacekeeping models, new training, assured funding, peacekeeping will not deliver the desired results. If the Council continues to be divided, unwilling, or unable to consistently support its field missions, particularly when these challenges arise, there will be way too many fires to douse. And therefore, in such situations of geopolitical shifts, as Fifi has said, missions will need to be smart. They need to be dynamic. And leadership, Johannes and I were discussing about leadership. We need leaders who are bold and daring to speak up. Right now, we all queue and we think we are blessed and recognized when the king drizzles a little bit of his smile on us in the White House. That's not going to help us. We need the boldness and the daringness to say no. In such situations, we need dynamic leadership and leaders who serve as ambassadors for peace. The UN doesn't always appoint the best and the brightest. We need those who are smart and are ambassadors for peace, and who maintain trust with the people that they are supposed to serve. Go out there, shake hands, pat people on the back, reassure them. Understanding the shifting political context and learning how to adapt and to maneuver. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kwesi. Really, always fascinating to listen to you. You always bring the unfiltered drama, and also, I feel, always show some position that is not just the normal one, which whatever you can take that in whichever way you want, but you always bring something new and some new angle on this intractable. There are a lot of issues that you're talking about that can't be solved, and at least not easily. So thank you very much for that. We go to the other side of the continent. Well, since you're from Ghana, we're coming to Ethiopia now, in Addis Ababa. And David Johannes will be discussing sort of, I guess, where peacekeeping is moving, what it is morphing into, and specifically working around the issue of ad hoc coalitions. We're talking about a turn, but as Arthur said, it's not really a turn because, or who did, was it you, Kwesi? It's not really a turn, it's actually the reality in many ways. So before I start doing a presentation on my own, David, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Peter. Also, thank you, the organizers, but also the Danish Foreign Policy Society for inviting us actually to be here. So if I look like someone who has just come from a gym, you can actually blame it an airline which actually failed to deliver my luggage twice in 24 hours. But I'm also reassured that being so informal is not highly frowned upon in Denmark. So I think it looks It looks I'm in a good hands. So I'll start by reflecting on the title of the presentation itself, because it helps us to appreciate two critical dimensions. First of all, it draws our attention to the decline in the multilateral peace and security frameworks, to the geopolitical rivalries, which has been the key theme in the past presentation. But also it draws our attention again to the emergence of what is called the ad hoc coalition, or what is called in the literature to the ad hoc term, perhaps as a viable option when the multilateral frameworks are failing us actually. For us, but I just want to emphasize one point from the get-go. Much as the focus is on the ad hoc coalition, I would actually like to argue that the ad hoc coalitions that we are talking about, they are also prone to the geopolitical rivalries that we are talking about. In fact, my key argument is that even in the context of geopolitical competition, ad hoc coalitions themselves can end up instruments of ad hoc competition, so which I'm going to develop later. So I'm situating my presentation in the context of the ongoing discussion around the challenges in the international order and its implication for peace and security. So we've all been following this discussion in the Davos Munich Security Conference, and in fact, the recently concluded the African Union Assembly. Much of the discussion has been how the international global order, the international order, has been unraveling and what it means for peace and security, both in the regional and the global dimension. So this moment of uncertainty, in fact, allows us to examine two aspects. One is the strain that most multilateral mechanisms are facing, and secondly, the simultaneous rise of ad hoc security coalition as a gap fillers in their absence. So my objective is very straightforward in the sense that to look at the declining multilateral engagement, but situating the conversation in the last 10 years, but with a focus on the current moment. And then to critically interrogate the value and limitation of ad hoc security coalition in Africa and their current status, and from a policy point of view, propose some practical option for balancing ad hoc coalition within the AU and the UN intervention. So my approach will be that not to romanticize ad hocism, but really to critically examine its prevalence, effectiveness, and novelty. So balance and integration is my core theme here. So my argument, as I said, is very straightforward. First of all, the overall significance and prevalence of ad hoc coalition should not be overstated. And secondly, the policy priority should be to integrate and to balance ad hoc coalitions within existing multilateral frameworks. But we have to establish, and the basis of my analysis would be, of course, some of the existing publication on ad hoc security coalition, especially by John Karlsrud and colleagues, but also our own continuous analysis of the peace and security landscape and the intervention. In our institute, at the Institute for Security Studies, we provide a continuous analysis of the peace and security landscape, but also the response as well. And we've also been involved in a number of ongoing review processes. We've been contributing to the discussion on the review of the future of all forms of UN peace operations, but also a lot is happening at the African Union side, even though the results can be, may not be as pronounced. There are a number of discussions around the strategic review of the Africa Standby for concept, but as well as there was some process which has been underway since August, which is a review of the peace, security, governance frameworks of the AU, so that they would be much more aligned to the current conflict landscape. But we have to establish a common basis by what we are talking about by ad hoc coalition. So these are operations that are mounted by a coalition of the willing. They are usually short-term, deployed outside of the multilateral frameworks, and they are cross-border in nature, so that they would allow what is called hot pursuit of violent extremism groups and armed groups of a similar nature. So their scope is usually regional, and they are predominantly military or security focused. So at the background, you always have to keep in mind the criticism of most of the multilateral frameworks and the deployments therein, namely the failure to provide political solutions. So ad hoc coalitions are purely militaristic solutions to very complex problems. So I would like to interrogate these ad hoc coalitions, both qualitatively and quantitatively, or to interrogate the ad hoc third. My key point in this regard is, of course, the research it shows that ad hoc coalitions, or the phenomena of ad hoc coalitions, have actually grown globally. I would argue that the turn seems to be modest on the continent, and both in terms of qualitatively and quantitatively. If you just look at the current moment, there is only one ad hoc coalition on the continent, which is MNJTF, and this can be contrasted with the 6 missions by the UN and the AU at the moment. So this is a graph of 2026. So we have about 5 UN missions and 1 mission by the AU, and this can be contrasted with the 1 ad hoc security coalition, which is the MNJTF. So this is where we start really questioning if it's the prevalence of these missions on the continent. And secondly, you can also take a step back, and how does it look like in the last 8 years? So 2017 seems to be, let's say, the peak time or the heyday of ad hoc coalition on the continent. And even back then, there were 4 concurrent Africa security initiatives, ad hoc security initiatives, or ad hoc missions, about 5 of them. So even then, the comparison was that there were 8 UN and AU missions as opposed to 4 ad hoc missions, 4 ad hoc security initiatives. So what does this mean? So these numbers, they tell us in a bigger story. First of all, there are more multilateral operations than ad hoc coalition, if you look at the last 10 years or so. And secondly, both ad hoc coalitions and multilateral operations are in a contraction mode. But this is not for the absence of, or the improvement of the conditions on the ground. On the contrary, there are a number of situations that warrant the deployment of these missions, whether ad hoc coalitions or those by the UN and AU. So there is a paradox there. And the prevalence of these traits also tells us most of these ad hoc security coalitions have not fulfilled the primary objective of stabilizing the context. So basically, this tells us they have not fulfilled their initial objectives. So that means the decline in the number of ad hoc coalitions as well as the multilateral operations also means that both are subjected to the same set of challenges, which we can discuss later, namely the lack of political support. So there's no reassurance that ad hoc coalition would also be getting the kind of political support from those who are deploying them, which I'll try to show with a regional context. So advantage, let's also continue looking at their the interrogations through their qualitatively, namely, normally they are actually celebrated as gap fillers because the bureaucracies of the UN and the AU, it takes time to deploy missions. There are also doctrinal limitations when it comes to missions, but also when it comes to the AS, to the African Union, there are institutional bottlenecks and resources and so on and so on. So it's usually a long time to deploy, but ad hoc coalitions are easy to deploy. So they have speed as their strong advantage. And they can easily bypass the long bureaucratic approval processes which take a lot of consultations. So they are also flexible and agile. So if a mission is to do a hot pursuit of a violent extreme groups, they are better suited to that kind of context. So they also have low cost in terms of creation, operation, and also closure. And that's why they are termed as, they can provide targeted a la carte conflict management in the literature. but their disadvantage simply outweighs the advantage that we're talking about. First of all, they are very short-term in their scope. So they would also provide us a very securitized and militarized responses to complex situations. So they are not in sync with the prevailing notions that there needs to be a primacy of politics in peace operation. So there is a major gap in this regard. As I said, there are also narrow security focus and insufficient attention to political solutions, leading to militarization of peacekeeping. And there are major accountability gaps when it comes to international human rights law, protection of civilians, and so on and so on. 5 minutes. And one of the most important limitations is that they actually lead to the erosion of the legitimacy of existing institutions. The Africa Peace and Security Architecture, or the UN, and this is what is termed in the literature as deinstitutionalization. And they're also subject or prone to the same kind of resource competition and financial volatility. But I would like to draw attention to some of the most recent challenges that they are facing, namely, they are also part and parcel of the geopolitical rivalry. If you look at the collapse of the G5 Sahel, it is a story of how the ADO coalition has become entrapped in the regional geopolitics. And the same can be said about the SADC mission in DRC, which has become embroiled in the prevailing DRC and Rwanda tension. But I can reflect more about the difficulty of launching an ADO coalition in a fragile hotspot like the Horn of Africa, where I came from. Literally, with the current kind of geopolitical realignment that's happening within the region itself, the kind of tensions that the neighbors are having with each other, it's very difficult to launch an ADO coalition. That's why I keep on emphasizing that in this kind of a geopolitical rivalry, ADO coalition can easily become instrument of ADO competition. So the last point is in terms of, so what's the way forward? The way forward, I would emphasize, it rests in terms of how do we balance and integrate ADO coalition into existing multilateral frameworks. There are at least 3 considerations needs to happen. The first one is reckoning, which I would call that, first of all, what is lacking with the current frameworks, whether with the African Standby Force or with the UN peace operation frameworks. So there are ongoing reviews, which is a review of the future of all forms of UN peace operation, but also at the African Standby Force strategic review. I'm emphasizing on this point because these are, however imperfect this process can be, this is the only game in town. So we need to politically and from a policy perspective engage with these processes. So the political commitment existing doesn't allow us really to start afresh with some kind of a major overhaul of this kind of framework. So it's important to engage with these processes. And secondly, which I would call is recognize how ADO coalition can be complementary value in terms of really supplementing the existing toolbox. And third one is, of course, integrating them in the existing frameworks. So there are a couple of opportunities from an AU point of view. There is an ongoing strategy review of the Africa Standby Force concept. So this helps us to clarify. So it allows even room to deploy Africa Standby Force ad hoc initiatives within these frameworks, but in a manner that is synchronized and structured manner. So with the AU playing some kind of role. And for the UN also, there are a number of initiatives. There are lessons also from G5 initiative like that. So my last point being, but all of this rests on a number of assumptions, namely, first of all, will the current reformation initiatives, will they succeed? And secondly, will the turbulence of international order stabilize for the reforms to succeed? And thirdly, how do we harness the speed and agility of ADO coalition while anchoring them in accountable, sustainable, and institutionally grounded framework? So ultimately, balance and integration are important, but much of it rests on these scenarios. Thank you very much.
Thank you. David, I think one of the reasons we wanted to hear about ad hoc coalitions really was also to look to some sort of future of intervention practices on the African continent. And obviously, you know, that what you're saying is it's not really the future of interventions, multilateral, however big that group is, interventions on the continent. And I think that's really good opportunity to invite everybody who was on the panel to up here on the floor. What do you call it? It's not really a, what is this? Just a space up front to discuss really what I think we need to expand the sort of conversation from UN peacekeeping and really look at what do interventions look like in Africa with the weakness of the multilateral system. And when it's weak for the UN, it's certainly also weak for the AU. Coalitions not really either being seen as a solution, regardless of whether it is a solution or not. It's definitely being seen as one. So in that space, with the types of conflicts that are still happening, with the types of military coups that are also happening in West Africa, sort of like multiple military coups, sometimes within the same country as in Mali. What do interventions to stabilize, to build peace, to whatever we want to call it, in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, what does that look like? Is my question to myself. And I hope, especially the last two presentations, which were directed more to that question, maybe we could start with sort of like maybe synthesizing your thoughts on that, Kwesi and David, and then we'll move on to the three former speakers.
I wasn't listening. I was trying to fix my headphones.
Okay. So what do interventions sort of like? What's the future of the discussion here? Is what the future of UN peacekeeping looks like in Africa, and maybe we need to expand a little bit. What is possible on the African continent in terms of finding collective solutions? Maybe is that not even a possibility on the African continent at the moment? And what then do attempts to stabilize, militarily intervene, build institutions? What will that look like in the coming years with a weak multilateral system and ad hoc coalitions that are not seen as solutions? And what are we looking at?
Well, I think we are learning from the ad hoc coalitions. I mean, I agree with what Johannes said, but with the reduction in multilateral support and interventions, I mean, African governments and institutions or organizations don't have a choice. So the multinational joint task force is the only one in existence now. 3 weeks ago in Accra, all West African leaders met, and the conversation was, how do we expand and strengthen the ECOWAS standby force to be able to respond to the ever-changing dynamics? And I think on the ECOWAS side, there are plans on the table to build a new battalion with an annual budget of $2.5 billion or something of that sort. That might take a couple of years to come into force. But there's a recognition on the sub-region that it cannot be business as usual, that the region's leaders cannot continue to wait for resources that are not forthcoming, whilst the problems are getting bigger and bigger. So I sense a certain agency and urgency to have these conversations. Finally, that one of the positive spin-offs of democratic governance is that we're able to have these conversations amongst ourselves without being described by our governments as terrorists. You know, so there's a critical discourse going on, certainly in West Africa, I don't know about other sub-regions, that we need to do something. The climate change is a problem. The youth bulge is a problem. You know, so small arms are all over the place. the extremist discourse is easy to get on all these social media platforms. So there's a recognition that something must be done. And at least from the ECOWAS side, as I'm saying, there are these conversations and a meeting has been held, plans are being drawn up. So whilst we believe in a multilateral system, I think West African states are willing and prepared to take the initiatives themselves.
I have many follow-up questions, but I won't do that. So I'll just actually maybe before David, maybe Charlotte.
It's a very broad and very difficult question, and I don't think I've got a response to it. But I've got an analysis, a little bit of the situation on the ground. As Kwesi you talked to, I mean, there's so little appetite for settlement of conflicts at this moment in time. And obviously it's the geopolitical situation around the world, but it creates in many places of conflict a state of impunity. I'm talking, I mean, you could mention many examples. The examples I'd like to bring here is Sudan. What the international community has been watching for the last number of years in a civil war in Sudan is simply watching, putting a few drops of oceans of humanitarian assistance in, 100 actors trying to engage, but with a lot of different interests in that conflict, oftentimes fueling it more than trying to solve it. So we are actually, as we speak, installing levels of impunity around the world, and as you spoke to, Kwesi, lack of respect for international humanitarian law. And that comes for, the respect for the peacekeepers, it's also respect for humanitarian workers, and it's respect for civilians and civilian infrastructure altogether. And this needs to stop because it moves in a very wrong direction. So this is more a plea and a call to action rather than a solution. At this moment in time, it's also become popular for the international community to withdraw development cooperation and engagement in any kind of international work on building peace. And this is the wrong direction to go. So if, for instance, Europe wants to step up vis-a-vis a US that is acting in a very strange way and withdrawing in so many different ways, it is not enough to build military capacity to deal with the wars next to your home. You also need to invest in building global peace, in engaging with soft power, in engaging internationally and globally. And I think our good friend Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, said it very wisely in Davos. I mean, if these regional actors and regional mid-range forces want to play a role in the world, they need to get their act together. So this is sort of more a plea on all actors to gear up because the world is moving in the wrong direction. Having said that, I think it's also clear that, and I think we saw it here clearly, we cannot do without multilateral peacekeeping. We cannot do without regional actors on the ground. So I think we need all hands in deck, but we need to work smarter on peace building. There is not massive amounts of resources available at this moment in time. So these missions that we install need to be smarter. They need to be adaptable to the environment and change their mandates and become flexible. But they also need to work in accordance or in coordination with governments. I think some of the most successful missions that we have seen, and now Ellen Margrethe left the room, the Ellen and the Ellen in Sierra Leone back then actually was a very hefty power couple because there was the ownership of the government to move the country forward, and there was a very strong leadership on behalf of the UN to do so. So it's also, where does the multilateral system use their resources? I mean, where is it possible to actually make progress? And that's where we need to work. And I think we have been obviously skeptical about the state of affairs of UN peacekeeping, regional missions, but there's not a lot of other things to replace it, frankly. So I think we should be also mindful that these are the best instruments that we know for now. So it's about being smarter and better at applying those instruments. Thanks.
Thank you. I think it's not just, I don't think it's not a plea as much as also a diagnosis that you're also giving here, because I think what we're lacking is really sort of an understanding of what are we doing this for and what is sort of the motivation behind it. We want to save lives, but also what is the broader idea that we're going out into the world with? And we had that until 10 years ago. We were going out to stabilize through building sort of functioning liberal democratic institutions. We thought we can't even pretend anymore. We pretended for 5-10 years. We stopped pretending now, and we don't have what is it exactly that we're going out into the world and doing. And I think that is one of the struggles that I'm having. What types of interventions can we rationalize in this age, in this time? And I think you say it well, and I think maybe Arthur wants to come in.
Yeah, thanks. Now I'm going to echo some of the things that Charlotte was just talking about. I think we agree on the diagnosis. Is like, today there are very few conflicts out there that are immune from geopolitics, right? And that makes it much more difficult to agree on a course of action, whether at the regional level or at the global level in the council. And then conversely, like the geopolitics contaminates the council and the ability to agree on deploying, authorizing any kind of mission for that matter, right? Because if it is a Chapter 7, ultimately it needs to come to the council. I think in the short term that makes it, the fact that there's less appetite from the host countries for those kind of missions that are quite intrusive, right, on your sovereignty. There's less money. Clearly, it's a big issue. We haven't talked about it, but it is also an impact of the geopolitics. And there's less political consensus. Means that we won't see any major multidimensional peace operations in the short term. And as a matter of fact, we heard that there hasn't been any for the last 12 years authorized. For a while, we thought that the political missions were an alternative to that. That's a whole other discussion. I think we need to have the discussion as a full spectrum. I think they've also showed quite a bit of the limits, and they're also affected by this in many ways. So now we have like the alternative offers, right, which are ad hoc. And there I think they're apples and oranges, because I'm always a little bit uncomfortable talking about the MNJTF, Accra Initiative, or G5 as missions. Frankly, these are just countries who agreed to cooperate with their troops staying on their own territory with a right of pursuit. To me, it's not a mission. It's not an operation. An operation is countries. Troops going into another country. But anyways, that's another discussion. So we have ad hoc missions. We have mercenaries, frankly, because a lot of countries also in the current context, but also because of technological advances with the drones, etc., think they can win militarily, right? Which we didn't have for many years. It was sort of an accepted thing that we would, conflicts were ending in negotiated settlements. Now it's not the case anymore. So then why would you go for a peace operation when I can actually call friends for bilateral support or mercenaries to try to achieve military victory, right? That's actually a better proposition, except that all those things are not necessarily working, right? And they're not working better than peacekeeping. For all the flaws of peacekeeping, they're not working better.
That's true.
And that's sort of the silver lining in this, and I think Haiti is an interesting indicator, and I think we might see more of that. It's like the US thought that it was better to go with a coalition of the willing, and then a year later they're like, well, let's come back to the council, to the UN, and let's see if we can get a support mission, because the funding and the reimbursement system is actually interesting, and that's what motivates TCCs, partly, not only, partly. And it's fascinating to see like the military advisors from the U.S. mission in Haiti, the U.S. embassy in Haiti, coming to the UN asking them how it's done. So there's so we might see that coming. But on a bigger, maybe to end with a bigger point, I think I see two main risks right now going forward. Is that power rivalries further constrain peacekeeping, or conversely, that power rivalry leads to a complete withdrawal, and that's even worse. In a way, geopolitics is it's the least bad option. If they continue competing within the multilateral system, yes, it constrains peacekeeping, but it's the least bad. The worst is that they completely walk away from it, right? And historically, we've always seen like peacekeeping, peace operations authorized when there is enough interest of the great powers or the regional powers because they see potential consequences at the regional level or global level, instability, migration, whatever, terrorism, you know. So, but they don't want to do it themselves. If the interest is high enough, they'll do it themselves. Even they'll bypass the council if it needs to be, right? From Vietnam to Iraq, that's what the US does, right? They'll do it themselves. But you know, if there's this middle space that I think could still reappear, which means like that, then there's and when this reappears, it might not be tomorrow, it might be the day after tomorrow, or the day after tomorrow.
Next year.
Then we need to have preserve the know-how of how we put together this kind of operations. Because the problem is the longer you go without operations being deployed, the more risk you lose the institutional knowledge, the people, and the systems. Right?
Thank you very much. Very interesting, and I think also pointing to the future. I just want to say the questions. We're having a panel discussion first, and then we're inviting questions. I can see people are really wanting to ask some questions, which is great. But Fifi, David, do you want to come in? Or?
Just quickly, in terms of the future of intervention, we can talk of two scenarios: one the positive one, and the second one. Not so positive one, which is a continuation of the status quo. The positive one is someone which raised there would be some stability in the global regional geopolitical rivalry, leading for some sort of consensus in the global multilateral order. That is a positive scenario. And for that, this would allow current reform initiatives to succeed, and there will probably some of these multilateral frameworks would be better. That is the positive one. The not so positive one, and the most likely scenario, would be a continuation of more of the same. So if this is the scenario, which is most likely going to be, we can map out the different forms of intervention going forward. The first one is a room for UN peacekeeping operation in interstate tension. There was a session of the Peace and Security Council of the AU in New York at a ministerial level, which kind of recognized the rise in interstate tensions as one of the key threats. And the AU Commission have actually stated in that room that there were that was 2024, about 12 set of interstate rivalry on the continent. So this tells us there is a rise on that one. So that gives a room for the UN also to deploy some peace operation. And these are not definitely going to be like big multilateral peace operation, but with targeted peace, like ceasefire monitoring and so on and so on. I think what we need to add to the mix is even the so-called peacekeeping skeptics, one of the P5, they have become selectively interested in some sort of country-level discussion in South Sudan, in DRC, and so on and so on. So there is some interest on that one. Until Arthur actually mentioned this point about the special political mission, I thought it would also one model that we can mix into the picture. But there is a lot of discussion about this modular peacekeeping, peace operation missions. How that translates into practice is something to look into, but there seems to be a lot of appetite, at least in the policy community as well. And then, of course, there would be some regional peace operations also going forward. But again, the issue of resources might also come into the mix. Thank you.
Okay. I mean, maybe just to add briefly to what my colleagues said, I guess perhaps we might have to also start looking at different kinds of peacekeeping operations in a way, looking at the current challenges that we are confronted with, because I doubt if we're going to have, like a 15,000, 10,000 being deployed into any mission environment. And now perhaps maybe what we could look out for is maybe issue-based mission deployed. So beyond the political missions, we can maybe perhaps have like human rights missions. We can have other targeted missions with very specific objectives that goes in to sort of target the challenges that are on the ground. I guess we need to look at different options and alternatives. In my local parlance, they said, too much meat doesn't spoil the soup. So we need to look at whatever is out there and be able to bring it into the drive towards resolving those different conflict situations.
I think sort of like there's this idea that doing something is better than doing nothing, and I'm really not a fan of that saying. I think sometimes it's better to do nothing if you don't have anything better to do than you had planned. At the same time, I think it was Richard Gowan who said that the UN would never ever come into existence if it was today. There would have been no chance that the UN would exist as a global organization. So we should also try to take care of it, as you say, Arthur, right? Because it will not come back. If it collapses onto itself, for whatever reason, because we withdraw support for it, all of us, then we will not have that global forum to have these types of discussions. And that would also be a huge loss globally, I think, sort of like... Anyway, do you want to say just the last words before we open up to questions, or should we open up to questions? Okay. You're still alive and awake, and that is a wonderful thing to see. So at the back, there's a question.
Hello, can you hear me? Yep. My name is Sunra Lambert-Bai. I work for Oxfam Denmark. And I'd just like to thank you for the enlightening and thought-provoking discussions and presentations we've had today. I work as a humanitarian and peace-building advisor. And basically, we've heard a lot today about the need for more legitimacy on the ground, more tailored responses. We've heard about the multi-billion-dollar Christmas tree mandate type missions and the challenges we've had, and some of us have quite clearly worked in those environments. We've heard about ad hoc missions. I'll try not to go on too long. But we as Oxfam, we don't directly engage in peacekeeping missions. That's not as a criticism, but we have our humanitarian principles which we need to adhere to. And we do engage, but not directly. But instead, what I wanted to focus here is a little bit more on the legitimacy, because we've looked at a lot of the different things that are happening, but some of the most cost-effective and more immediate kind of protection gains could also perhaps be looked at through locally led responses, which we haven't really discussed today. What I mean by locally led responses is that many communities are engaged in de-escalation measures, in dialogue, in conflict management of some kind or another. And it's usually very cheap. It doesn't cost multi-billions, that's for sure. So how can we, in kind of working in this peacekeeping policy and donors and all the other NGOs and civil societies that are engaged in this, really work towards supporting more locally led systems? Is there a space for that? Is there a space when we're talking about new peace-building approaches to look at how we can go beyond just having traditional peacekeeping hard security lens and extend that to more legitimate community-based structures that could not replace it by any means, but definitely complement it? Thank you.
Charlotte, I think this is obviously something that's close to what you're talking about, but do you want to?
Yeah. Thanks for that question. I hope I spoke to it a little bit in my intervention, exactly to establish that a lot of local initiatives and a lot of local capacity already exists on the ground that needs to be built on. One of the concerns, however, and I think there's an ample game for humanitarian actors and also development actors on the ground to work on actually nurturing that capacity and bringing it in to the picture when we talk about establishing peace. One of the concerns that we as humanitarian actors have is obviously that we become instrumentalized into a stabilization agenda. So that suddenly, the focus has to go to where any peacekeeping intervention operation needs to go to stabilize at this very moment. And that could hamper the focus that the humanitarians have on staying neutral and delivering assistance where it's most needed. And these ways of engaging can sometimes be contradictory. But in the general sense, yes, building that capacity and building on that capacity in whatever sort of all the actors on the ground do is important. And that's why I also think that the role of multilateral or whatever kind of international engagement in peace building in the country to build that local capacity and use it and leave local institutions in place to take over when peacekeeping withdrawals is extremely important. And that's why I think whenever a big multilateral or a regional peacekeeping operation goes in, we need to think about transition and exit right from the start. And part of the exit is obviously for local actors to do the work continuously. At the end of the day, it is the government that is responsible. It is the local communities, local authorities that will be responsible for the protection of the civilians in their neighborhood for the time to come. So thanks a lot for that question.
So thank you very much. So what does war do, or periods of extreme fragility and violence do to local people and local institutions? It creates a sense of suspicion. It creates a sense of mistrust. It creates a sense of the other. But were we to look at the language that we use in seeking to build peace, that language is usually exclusionary, and it's a language that ordinary people or ordinary communities can't identify. And I think the fulcrum around which we should work as humanitarians and peace builders is that irrespective of what we do, those local communities are going to remain, whether good or bad. So we need to ask ourselves, what are the most critical institutions and processes and mechanisms of credibility and of sustainability? And how do we, by our actions, invite them to partner and to collaborate? Let's not forget that for most of these communities, this is not the first time that they are seeing an international humanitarian group coming. So there is a certain fatigue. Okay? So how do we go beyond the suspicion and the fatigue of local people who actually do need the help and then the presence of these organizations? And we need a new language that is sensitive, reflective, and inclusionary. But we also need to identify the institutions that these communities respect and understand. Institutions that have a voice that is based on history, on identity, and on credibility. And I think when we manage to build this trust and this space where we learn to listen, because we simply don't know how to listen. And I think there should be a course in listening, and listening carefully. You see, because words do have power. And sometimes, for those of us who come from cultures of strong oral traditions and non-written forms of expressions, the way you tie your headgear, the way you tie your cloth, where the knot is, little things that here, as Johannes said, here informality is the style. But in certain situations, that may be seen as quite an offensive behavior. So I'm a very strong advocate for bringing people in, or bringing communities in, identifying credible leaders, and talking to them. That can be done, but I think we need that humility to say, look, these people are poor, they are battered, they are sick, they are confused. I would say want to go and respect them, listen to them. Probably that would be a very good start to rebuilding these communities.
Arthur and then David.
No, thanks for the question. I think it's an essential part. I mean, there's a lot of great work done by the NGOs on this. But if you're looking at peacekeeping, there's a real tension. Unarmed protection, as we call it, has gained a lot of traction in peacekeeping as well. Whether through the doctrine, if you look at the POC, protection of civilian approaches, physical protection with peacekeepers is only one of the aspects. And like if you look at what the civil affairs section division in South Sudan, for instance, in UNMISS has been doing. They've been nicknamed the Cattle Affairs Division. This is all, civilian approaches to protection. The work we did in Mali, in central Mali, because we didn't have troops precisely, because that part of the mandate was added later in 2019, and most of the troops were in the north. The mission had to get creative and work mostly with local actors, do local mediation type of work. So there's plenty of that is being done, except that whenever you try to push this, and there was a big push during the HIPPO, for those who were following the jargon UN, there was a big reform discussion on the last big one in 2015. And one of the panel members, Youssef Mahmoud, especially pushed for this. It made it into the report, but then subsequently, when you go back to the member states, the UN is still a member states-led organization, and this tends to be lost. The focus on community, people-centric approaches, etc., is never sustained. Plus, in addition to this, there's what Peter talked about in his introduction. Post 9/11, there's also the stabilization turn, let's say, and more militarized approaches that also affected peacekeeping, like it affected everything else, right, in the world. And so there's that, there's a tension. Just one last point maybe I'll make is that, because I've been witness to, in my own UN career, I started in 2005, and I finished after Mali. And I observed it myself, the UN became a target. Well, we usually place it with the Baghdad bombing, right? But when I started, we would go into areas controlled by rebels. Two of us, I would go with a military observer, unarmed, we'd walk hours and not fear for our lives, and that's how we would engage. That photo, when I go up to northern Mali, I have a whole company, and the French put a drone in the air, because the risks are much greater, so it depends a lot on the context as well. The work that the peacekeepers can do unarmed depends very much on the context, and unfortunately, the environments have been hardened, and I know, your NGOs have also faced that, and are facing a lot of dilemma in terms of, whether you accept armed protection, whether from the authorities or international forces, in a context where you are no longer immune, no longer protected just by the principles that should be protecting you.
David?
Yeah. Just to add to what Arthur has said, of course, this kind of locally led initiatives for protection of civilians and all of that, they've been tried. And even there is an ongoing research that we are doing with the Non-Violent Peace Force, an NGO which tries to promote community-based approaches to protection. We've been looking at these questions, but the challenge remains that it's not for the lack of trying or for the lack of recognition of the value of these initiatives, but these kind of approaches, they seem to be swimming against a very strong current. So how does this kind of approaches look like in Somalia, for example? So basically it is something almost very difficult. So this needs to be recognized. Rather, the solution should be that this kind of approaches should be part of the wider toolbox, side by side with the formal approaches like to protection of civilians and all of that.
You want
yes,
to?
I mean, there's a classical example was when we were in a BA and then conducting an interview. Every community that we went with an armored vehicle, and then like a whole team of about 7 or 8 really armed officers with us. And I remember in one of the situations, the community were complaining that, listen, even when we want them to sort of shepherd us into our farms because we think we'll be attacked, they give us the excuse of not being able to do it. But for you, just 2 researchers, you come with a whole team. So it tells you the situation really on the ground with respect to the issue of working with communities. But I also think the environment has also shifted considerably. And so peacekeepers are also really at risk. I remember when we did the effectiveness of peace operation working in Mali, for instance, and we went to Kidal and went to Mopti, we just couldn't go to the communities. I mean, you cannot go to the community. So perhaps, I mean, and then you have peacekeepers living in this bunkerized community and not really interfacing with the local community. So we need to find a way of engaging peacekeepers to develop their skill where beyond all of this risk, they will be able to sort of interface with the community. I think if you are not able to do that, then we risk that sort of challenges that we are being confronted with. Yeah.
That is a big challenge. Did you want to say something? Okay. Christian, Efwa, and then the person at the back, and then Humphrey. But we'll start with Christian, please. He's. I don't know. Can you yell? Can you?
Thanks, Peter. It works now. First of all, thank you for putting this together. It's been really, really interesting. My name is Christian Fischer. I'm a former director of DEES, and also has worked a fair bit on African peacekeeping in the Ministry of Defense. And I have two questions, and I think they're mostly for Kwesi and for Johannes and Fifi. My two questions are dealing with the capacity building part and what we can do from a European side, especially on the Nordic side, because we Nordics have been working very closely together with African partners, especially on the East African Standby Force build up. If you want to have good support, it's very important to be able to say what has been achieved so far. And we worked on enhancing African peacekeeping capabilities for more than 20 years. What would you say has been achieved if you should say this out in the public in the Nordics? And secondly, a second question is on what sort of policy advice would you give to the Nordic countries? Where would they be useful in supporting building up African peacekeeping capabilities? Would that be? I hear you, Kwesi, saying a little bit about the institutional as being a bit fragmented. Would it be more towards a more national support, and in which areas would we be achieving the best? Would it be by donations, material, training, etc.?
Thank you, Christian. I think because there are more questions now, I think we're going to do a little bit because otherwise. So just remember those questions. And Efwa?
Thank you very much. My name is Efwa Lamte. I'm based at the University of Leipzig in Germany. And it's always a pleasure to listen to the panelists, especially Professor Enin and Fifi Eduafo, whom I know from the Kofi Annan International Peacekeeping Training Center. So I have a very simple question. Considering the fact that a lot of the peacekeeping missions take place on the African continent, looking ahead at the future of UN peacekeeping, what specific role or what more can African actors such as the African Union or the regional economic communities, what more can they do to be able to ride the tide in an era of geopolitical change? We have been talking a lot about African solutions to African problems. Is it time that the African actors themselves are able to exercise a bit more agency and possibly carve more specific roles for themselves in the future of UN peacekeeping? Thank you.
I think we're going to take those two questions first, and then we're going to take 3 other questions. So please, panel, discuss. No pressure.
No, perhaps I'll just start with the first question in terms of what has been achieved. I think this was like 2-3 years ago when we did the domestic security impacts of peacekeeping. And
remember?
Yes. And we actually saw tangible things that perhaps comes from our engagement with international peacekeeping, how our militaries and police have changed in terms of the way they do their work back home. If for nothing at all, I think they become more responsive to human rights cases. They've become more responsive towards security provisions. They've become more respecter of rules and regulations in their action. These are all things that perhaps they learn from peacekeeping environments. These are mostly, some are norms, some are experiences that they gathered from peacekeeping, and we actually see a translation of that within in country. I'm not too old, but I remember when we were very young. I mean, when you saw the military, the green uniform, you would be afraid. I mean, in terms of you'd be whipped in line to sort of behave in a particular manner. But our militaries now have become very friendlier, and they've become, I think some are saying they've become more police in line, just because of some of the roles that they engage in the mission environment, which has translated positively to the way they go about their duties. So for me, I think there are a lot of benefits from this engagement in international peacekeeping operations. But obviously, training comes in with a lot of support that could be able to help bring about the change, especially also the change of mindsets of most of our troops. And I think it was captured in the Secretary General's report in terms of building the right mindsets for the kinds of environments within which we deploy our troops. So for me, I think there's a lot that has been achieved in that regard. I think I'll just, yeah.
Yes, David?
On top of what Fifi has mentioned, I think what has been achieved is also the creation of a community of practice. So this you will see it in the African missions that are deployed in the UN missions. These are people who've been trained through this Africa Standby Force frameworks. Leaving aside the fact that the AFSF has not been deployed in the original conception, that is a different debate. But at least we are seeing now people who've been trained together. But also in the hydro coalitions, these are the same people who've been trained, even though their original assumption was to be deployed in the ASF, they are now deploying this hydro coalition. So they will tell you that we've been trained in this course here and there and everything. But in terms of what to do also going forward, I think there is a logic and rationale to continue supporting what has been done so far. That's not the case of like pouring water into a barrel that has holes. That I don't think that is the case. For the mere reason that I don't think it makes sense to pull out support when the peace and security conditions are at the lowest. So that contradicts the original rationale of really putting your money in this kind of scenarios. And secondly, also, perhaps also engaging in some sort of strategic dialogue with these regional actors such as the African Union in terms of addressing the big strategic gaps. Not just focusing on the peacekeeping, but broadly looking at what's not working with Africa peace and security architecture. Perhaps that helps to address some of the issues. Yeah. Then maybe to my alma mater also the question from Leipzig University. I think in terms of going forward, the role for African actors is not only on the security front. There is a bigger role also for African actors to play in prevention. And this is a role that has been denied, the political role that has been denied, for example, for the African Union in Somalia. So for the longest time, it has also been a war-fighting machine. But it has been a war-fighting machine without really getting involved in the political side of the story. So that is where also a lot of emphasis should be made as well.
Well, so Christian, thank you very much. I think blanket capacity building will not cut it. There's a need for a conversation that identifies what the needs are. Because if you take the kinds of capacities that we built at the Kofi Annan Center the last 20 years, they are not the same capacities that are needed right now. Probably some of them are fairly standard: protection of civilians, election monitoring, election observation. But we are now moving to trainings that deal with violent extremism, terrorism, humanitarian issues. But the beautiful thing about the investments into capacity building has been that we've brought us, a community of practice, but increasingly soldiers, police officers, civilian actors who are beginning to share the same norms and values. And I can tell you, it's not an easy thing. Because these are soldiers who come to us, and they are used to behaving in particular ways in their own countries. And then we have to tell them, look, this is how you behave in particular context. You've got to show respect for civilian oversight. You've got to behave in this way. No. And I can tell you the number of non-verbals of protest that comes to us. And I can tell you the number of times my boss or my different bosses have been asked why they don't sack me from the Kofi Annan Center. So generating knowledge and the skill sets.
Wonder why.
So generating the skill sets that allows the soldiers and the police officers and even the civilians to behave in ways that contributes to peace building and re-establishing and strengthening communities is key. I don't believe in blanket donations because people will basically steal them. No. And I've always told people that particularly where you deal with countries that have institutions, that have processes and mechanisms, then apply the same rules of reporting. These are taxpayers' monies. They are not gifts. We've got to understand that we have a common interest in building peace and uniformed officers with the capacities to ensure that peace reigns. But what that means is that you can come and do business and invest. Okay, so we should meet at a middle point where you bring part of your training, intelligence analysis, how to gather the intelligence, how to, riot control is one of the weakest issues, but helping us in ways that are practical and useful. Okay, too often partners are coming with packages that are totally useless, but a box must be ticked in some capital or ministry somewhere. When you bring those capacities and equipment, we will take them, and within 2 years, you see them rusting on the roadside. So let's meet somewhere, a middle ground, and say, look, listen to us. And look, these are the needs. These are what we think we want, and then let's do that. But certainly we will need help with the training, the development of the manuals, the revision of the manuals. First, partners used to do that, and then suddenly they were too expensive to be brought to Ghana for 3 weeks and all that. So probably we need to go back to the drawing table. If we work under AU, I think you know my answer. Leadership, leadership, leadership. The leadership is non-existent. We are not hearing their contributions to the debate, predicated on principles and intellectual sophistication in presenting an African argument that says this is who we are, this is where we stand, this is where we are taking our continent. I think we can count on this hand how many of them are trying to do that. So we get the leadership right. They will ensure that the institutional values and norms are put into practice, and then together they can lead us. But right now, I think there's a huge gap there.
Arthur, do you want to? I think it was done. Were you done?
Yes.
Okay, good.
No, I mean, I just wanted to add one small thing, because if 100% with Kwesi on the leadership, and with Dawit with the fact that we shouldn't look at the partnership between the two organizations as purely military, and that the AU has a lot to do on politics, which then brings us back to leadership. But just if we look at the UN peacekeeping partnership, I think we got to recognize that there's a lot has been done in terms of the partnership, and recognition of the comparative advantages of the AU on a number of things, right? Ability to deploy quickly, bringing the political might of the countries that deploy with the troops, because when you deploy troops, you ideally also deploy the political might with it, and ability to also a number of comparative advantages. The problem is the one that is still not resolved is the issue of the funding, right? Mm-hmm. And then to bring us back to link with our discussion on the geopolitics is really interesting because we thought with resolution 2719 that we were finally going to resolve this. And it was because of the geopolitics that resolution was finally passed, right? Because the US administration, Biden, at the time, thought they would score some brownie points with the global south and notably with Africa, right? By finally accepting the, whatever formula of financing 75-25. And then that same resolution has never been implemented. So what could have been like a really a big leap forward on resolving one of the core issues is now becoming like a missed opportunity, because then the geopolitics meant that 2719 has never been implemented. And the more we go on, the more it's likely, and I don't know, I turn to the specialists, but that it's actually never going to be really implemented.
It will not.
And until the continent is able to sort out, and I think past 2719 now it's back on the shoulder, until the continent is able to fund a real portion of their own operations, their leverage will be limited, right? Because the only leverage, as Kwesi said earlier, is like, I don't deploy troops. That's my main leverage, right? Or I don't get involved politically. But until you have the financing, it's always going to be limited, I think.
More questions? Okay, so there's a person with a microphone. I think he wants to ask a question.
Yes. Yes. Can you hear me? Is it? Yeah, it's Fu. Sorry.
It's definitely on now.
So my question is, and hi, I'm Jeppe, and thank you for the presentation. My question is also a little bit related to leverage in the international organizations, especially when it comes to deployment of peacekeeping, as a contribution to peacekeeping. Here I'm especially thinking about like countries like Rwanda, how they have maybe had a leverage in the international organization, because I think they are the second most country with the second most attributions to peacekeeping missions. And maybe also in the future, if other countries would follow along with this kind of, would follow along with contribution. I know you talked a lot about defunding, but maybe a lot of countries would actually attribute more to the peacekeeping mission if they can see a leverage in having a bigger saying in the international organizations, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Humphrey?
It was mentioned in passing, but I'm interested in it. There was a question about misinformation and disinformation affecting sovereignty. And I'm curious as to how that works, because the last time I was in northern Ghana, I heard a lot and saw a lot of Russian propaganda on the ground, right? And I'm curious as to how sort of the ground level plays into the geopolitics and eventually undermines peacekeeping missions in that sense. The second question has maybe more for Fifi, that since soldiers are physically under attack, I was wondering how that undermines the effectiveness of peacekeeping missions, because I also know from my own research with Ghanaian soldiers that if they are going to an arena in which they know that they could be killed, they take other measures. They don't just go head in, but they prepare themselves and also make different risk assessments, right? Because they don't want to go and die in someone else's country. For what? So there's a conundrum there that maybe you could address for me. And the last question is for Arthur Butalis, because many years ago I heard you speak about MINUSMA and the role of the Chadian soldiers in there. And I was actually fascinated by the fact by how they went about peacekeeping. If you attack them, they don't just sit down and I thought that was actually maybe a refreshing way of doing peacekeeping. But since MINUSMA has been withdrawn, I'm wondering what happens to this kind of knowledge, because Johannes said something about community of practice. Maybe there should be a way also for African states to tap into this kind of practices and knowledges and experiences that come with that. So, yeah.
Thank you, Humphrey. One last question down in front here. Yeah. Yes.
A question for all of you, maybe more for Arthur, and it kind of bridges very well with other ones. I was just considering, so what is happening in the West African Sahel? And I know it's kind of a headache, but I wonder, so we see JNM, we see violent attacks, the fuel blockage, the question of fall of Bamako, this kind of situation, and then the alliance of Sahel states. First of all, what's your take on that? Having not been recognized by the African Union, still the cooperation with like Russia, China, so these kind of things. So could we see sort of UN coming back in? Like things are not working out very well. At the same time, we see the military leaders being backed up by the population, especially, I don't know the Mali context very well, but very liked in Burkina. So I just wondered, like sort of the situation that's going on there, would we see going back to sort of the old actors, or is China, Turkey, Russia sort of, yeah, taking over? Thank you.
Okay, a lot of questions. I hope you wrote them down, because I did not. So please, maybe we take it from Arthur. There was somehow a lot clustered around you. So maybe you can ask and reply to some of the... I don't want to put you on the spot. Like.
No, sure. I'll try not to be too long, because these are complex but excellent questions. On the question of leverage and the example of Rwanda, I think there are many reasons why countries contribute troops to peacekeeping, and they differ, of course, widely, and there's a whole literature on that. Rwanda is a particularly interesting case because they have a powerful narrative behind their deployments, right? It's because they felt they were failed, right, by peacekeepers during the genocide, and they're making up, and the African solidarity and so on. Even though, and you can ask my colleagues who are closer to the action in Addis, it's not the Rwandans are not always very well perceived, even though in Addis, but they push a narrative. They've championed the protection of civilians, including actually a more robust, which makes the link with the Chadian approach to POC. And indeed, through that, they're master at leveraging their contribution for influence. They got the force commander in MINUSMA, the first one, General Kazura, with whom I work very closely. When the Nigerian heavyweights, the Nigerians wanted it, right? You mentioned, I think, was like, they were quite upset because the Nigerians had contributed to the African operation, the intervention with the French and so on. Then they got OEF also, Francophonie in Paris, right? They got the SRG in Central African Republic. I mean, punching above their weight. They are excellent at this. So yes, it is a tool. Except when you no longer have peacekeeping missions, it's difficult to leverage this. Now that links to the Chadians. It was their first mission. I have lots of stories. I knew the Chadians myself from having served in MINURCAT, and I was the special assistant to the head of mission. I succeeded John Casford in Chad. And at the time, I was one of those who said that the peacekeepers should work more closely with the national forces, and it was very taboo because everybody thought the Chadian army was, unruly, and I'll spare you what people were saying about them. And then suddenly they arrive in peacekeeping. It took a lot of effort for the UN to accept them and to certify them to minimum standards. It was quite difficult. I think for the specific context in which they were deployed, they proved to actually be quite effective. Now the problem is their very robust response also caused some issues, that we had to deal with. Because when I think in many ways it was good that we had this robust response when they were attacked, because that sends a signal, and indeed, that also I think contributed to the credibility of the mission. But a lot of people were quite concerned with the human rights violation, right? Because they would go back out in full power, and civilians got killed along the way. The fact that we had later that MINUSMA had a Chadian SRG sheltered them a bit, and Nadif was a big also defender of this. Unfortunately, the lessons from Western peacekeepers are much better captured by the IIS and other think tanks in the West. I wish that maybe the ones in Africa also help those countries tell their stories and capture their own narratives on peacekeeping. I think that's essential. There's still not enough about that. So some Chadian or other African scholars would capture some of that. With that said, I'm hearing some rumors that the Americans might get to Chadians in Haiti. We'll see. It's going to be
God help them.
because they see the value. They see the value of robustness. Of course, it's not the same to operate, with technicals in a desert environment as to operating in an urban setting in Haiti. So I'm not saying it's necessarily a good idea. Yeah, and then so on what's happening in West Africa. Well, that's a very long conversation. As you've seen, as much as the French presence and municipal presence didn't prevent the jihadi armed groups from, progressively moving from northern Mali into central Mali, their departure and the Russian arrival has not prevented them from continuing to expand, mostly in rural areas. There's a massive presence. As I think was said earlier, I think, Kwesi, you mentioned there was a bit of a phantasm that those jihadi groups wanted to move to the coast to go to the beach, or I don't know what, control the ports. Clearly, that has been a bit debunked since. They find also a natural, I think, space in which they can evolve, and unless you manage to strike deals or to exploit local grievances, etc., it's difficult for them also to expand. Now, I'm sorry, I'm not doing justice to the theme, but then the IOS, if that's the question, the alliance between the three countries, I think, while there was quite a bit of communication around it, there was also, frankly, some level of enthusiasm from the populations from those three countries. I think we're starting to see the limits also, because the relationships between the countries themselves is also has some limits. And could the UN go back? I would say the UN hasn't left. There's still UN agency funds and programs there that are still operating. I think a peace and security presence is very unlikely in the short term. I think, there's a combination of actors. I think, when it comes to geopolitics, I think we should be careful of not looking at it as a binary of the Western partners left and the others are coming in. China has always been there. Russia was a major partner of Mali, from earlier times. They just, and some of the Western are still present, as we found out, in Niger during the attack. It became public that 300 Italian soldiers were still there as part of a partnership with the Niger government. I'll
Thank
stop
you.
here.
So, sort of final remarks from the rest of the panel on the questions. Do you want to come in?
Humphrey, this notion of misinformation, disinformation, Russia, China, yes, it's there. But our own politicians misinform and disinform us more. They lie to be able to get to power. They distort our history. They distort whatever developmental. I have very short shrift with these notions. We've got to look at our politicians and their levels of dishonesty. So the Danish development aid policy paper, where they spent a lot of time on Russian misinformation and disinformation, I tore it to shreds because that does not represent the reality. Our politicians are the biggest challenge. Chad, accepting Chadian troops reflects the dangers or the difficulties the UN has in getting well-trained, well-equipped troops. The Chadians, 20 years ago, would not have been touched with a 50-foot pole. They are brutal. A lot of them were basic criminals, and they had been paid. Mr. President gives it to Dawit. Dawit forms his militia. They are giving some very basic training. Off you go. No doubt they came back home and killed Hissan Habre. Okay, he paid for what he had trained. AES. Well, I think they've come. It will take some time. JNIM is expanding, but one thing that we haven't spent time on is understanding the expansion of these groups and how local African businessmen are crossing terrorist and extremist lines to do business. And that's the failure of intelligence across the sub-region. Tomatoes, onions, potatoes, diesel, soya beans, plastics, all kinds of dry food. How do ordinary traders get behind enemy lines where statutory security forces are unable to go to? But we are not asking these questions. And until we do, they will get more and more powerful. And actually, they don't need to come down south. In Ghana alone, we are smuggling $2.1 billion of alluvial gold to the terrorists. So when the notion of they want to come down south, we always question, come down south to do what? Because what they need, we are taking to them voluntarily. Gold, small, and I think gold is selling at $5,000 or $6,000 an ounce now. So you can imagine. It's easy to cross these boundaries and then exchange the gold. So there are some very hard questions that we need to be asking about the terrorist expansion. And I agree with Arthur. Russia has always been there for years. You know, in Niger, Mali, they built the airports, they expanded it all the way from the 60s and 70s. Probably the new boys on the block are the Turkish people. You know, the South Africans will not do it, although they have the capacity. Nigeria is still the big hegemon, but struggling to find its role. What it did in Benin was a one-off. Attempted coup in Benin, given intelligence by the French. They then invade, do a bit of bombing. But the interesting question is, 2 weeks before, there had been a successful coup in Guinea-Bissau, where the ECOWAS peacekeeping force was led by a Nigerian. But we are not raising these questions. Okay, and I'll repeat this in as gentle a voice as possible.
Let's hear that.
Until there's leadership that is consistent and driven by principles, of course, there will always be some calculations about national interest. We'll be having this meeting, and hopefully Peter will be bringing me to Copenhagen again, so I can continue meeting my old friend Henrik, who, as a fairly young man, he used to give me a lift to come to school here in Copenhagen. Yeah. So, Henrik, thank you very much. You have made it possible for me to be standing here today. Thank you.
Thank you. David, do you want to say something? To talk now or forever?
Sure. Just a general point around this prestige that comes with being the largest troop contributing country. I think that myth around being, that is, in my view, being increasingly debunked. I'm not going to speak about a particular case study, because how you behave in a peacekeeping setting is increasingly linked also how you behave regionally and nationally. So in the past, countries were able to get away with a lot of things just because that they are contributing to this kind of peacekeeping setting, but I think it increasingly it has also become how you behave regionally and nationally. Yeah.
Thank you, David.
Just mine is a small point about the risk of soldiers being attacked. I mean, if you look at it in terms of the mission environment, I think we need to go back to some of the MOUs that we've signed with some of these countries, the status of force agreement, and then also the status of mission agreement, and look at it in terms of its practicality on the ground. I mean, if I remember the last attack in the case of the Ghanaian troops with UNISFA, it was purely, so if they were really built well with the different actors on the ground, and if their operations was intelligence-led, they would not have found themselves in the place that they were at the time when the attack happened. So I guess it's more of engagement, but also a direct communication between the force headquarters and then the sectors. I find some disjoint in terms of communication, especially when they are from like different countries. It brings those kind of, and there's a lot of pressure on these commanding officers within some of these these sectors to deploy into certain dangerous areas, which has some sort of repercussions at the end of the day. So I think there needs to be a very synchronized approach towards dealing with their movement, and then also looking at it in terms of the MOUs that they sign. There's a reason why some countries will never deploy to certain areas, but we are more open and less confrontational when it comes to being asked to go to certain places, and it has its own risk that we need to perhaps engage going into the future. Yeah.
Charlotte, you get the final word. No word. No word. You're done. You're done for the day. Yeah, fair enough. So, can I? Do you want to? Can I? You want? Okay.
Then I'll say the closing words. If Peter, do you want to say also sum up, or should I?
Sum up? No, I think that's
no,
too
no,
much.
okay.
But I think we came into this room to sort of talk about what the future might look like in terms of not even just peacekeeping, but interventions. That's at least what I was interested in, to really understand what types of intervention can we look into in the future in Africa. And I'm afraid I'm not enlightened. I think we are definitely at a place in time where it's unclear what is motivating interventions and what they're going to look like. And I think it's back to sort of individual countries like Ethiopia going into unilaterally into Somalia or into its neighboring countries. Is it ad hoc, which you sort of like shut down? Is it a return of the UN? Is ECOWAS stepping up? I thought it was very interesting to hear you talk about ECOWAS, Kwesi, because I have to say, before you've not been that kind to ECOWAS and their ability to find common ground. Is that changing now because of also, I'm assuming also in Ghana, people are scared of what they're seeing around the region, right? And it's serious business. So I think we're really sort of, and then on the other side, of course, our focus is only on Russia and the Middle East. We don't go south of the Middle East at the moment, in Europe and in Denmark especially. And of course, Africa is not standing still. It's still our biggest neighbor. It's still our big neighbor, at least. It's still a place that is evolving and changing and influencing everything that goes on in Europe, as it has done throughout history. So I think it's going to be an interesting time, also for someone like me who will never, ever, sorry guys, I will never leave the continent. I will always come back to go south. I will not go east or west. And it's going to be an interesting time to follow politics and just seeing how it evolves in the years to come. That was my summary of the seminar, and can I just thank you also for coming. It's been truly interesting from my side. Thank you.
And so on behalf of the Danish Foreign Policy Society, I just want to say thank you to you all. Thank you to Dies and Peter Albrecht on the cooperation. Thank you, Kwesi. Thank you, David. Thank you, Fifi. Thank you, Charlotte. Thank you, Arthur, for the knowledge you brought to the fore. I think it gave some interesting perspectives of how the UN needs to adapt in the peace because of the changing circumstances. But it also provided some perspective on the ever concurrent demand for security. That is actually something, it's a basic human right. It's the first right to life. And I think that this is really something that we need to understand and to create a security structure, thinking around security as a basic human rights and how we actually create them. So just a big hand to you all. Thank you to the audience for active participation and listening and staying on. I'm sure that this will not be the last. I think Denmark, at least, even though we only have 1 year left in the Security Council, we would like a more permanent presence of Africa in the Security Council, and one of the reasons is actually to secure that the voice is heard there. So this is all for me. Thank you to Hermod Lanung Foundation providing the opportunity, and I think we need to give us all a big clap.
And thank you to Anna and Mathilde and Ida, and also from the Danish Foreign Policy Society, and also Emilie from DIS, my colleague, who's also been supporting and helping. Thank you so much for the collaboration to you from us. Thank you.